Hey everyone, hope you're all doing great. Welcome back to the Anime Fictions 2.0. Today, we're diving into part 2 of what if Naruto's isolation made him a cold, strategic ninja. If you're enjoying these alternate timelines, make sure to hit that subscribe button, share it with your friends, and check out the other videos on the channel. And of course, drop your thoughts in the comments. I always love hearing your ideas. Alright, enough talk, let's get into the story. Chapter 16, Glow of a Firefly. At the ripe old age of 5, Fu had quite confidently decided, in her not-so-humble opinion, that her home was the most beautiful place in the world. She lived in the village of Taki, an abode which nestled at the edges of the roots of an ancient, colossal tree that guarded them from the rest of the world. It towered over a sparkling clear lake which was pure enough to drink directly from, and farther down, a thin but regal waterfall, the namesake of their village, tumbled down over the side of a cliff. Fu and her mother lived together in a small, modestly decorated house at the farthest edge of the village, but they were also the closest to the guardian tree, so Fu never minded. The other village children never liked her anyways. Whenever she tried to join them as they played swim tag through the underwater roots, they threw rocks at her and told her to go away. It hurt, but Fu wasn't alone. She had her mother, a quiet older woman with long green hair and dark eyes. When her mother wasn't tired after a full day spent working in the village rice paddies, she would hold her hand and carry her up the trunk of the guardian tree to a faraway branch where they would sit and talk and laugh. She also had her pets. For her birthday present one year, her mother gave Fu a tank with a colony of white shirori, which were termite-like insects. A multitude of insects lived alongside the village people at the roots of the guardian tree, and it wasn't uncommon to adopt them as pets. Fu thought they were quite cute, with the way they squirmed around her fingers. At first, she'd had to take care of them outdoors after all. If they escaped, they could very well eat through the wooden frames of their house. However, once she'd found that she could control them if she fed them her chakra, her mother had allowed her to bring them inside their home. And finally, she had Komiai, a blue kabutamushi beetle, that lived inside her mind. "I think I'll try adopting some kabutamushi too," she told him, stroking his green wings. "So you'll have more beetle friends like yourself." "For the 7th time, I'm not a beetle," he said tiredly. "Whatever you say," she said, giving him a thumbs up. If Fu had to decide what the best part of Takigakure was, it would have to be the Firefly Festival. Every summer, the festival was the one night a year when everyone's houses were dark. All the villagers rowed out to the lake in their canoes with their lanterns. When the sun set and everything was pitch black around them, they opened them and let the fireflies fly out. The glowing fireflies and their reflections in the lake illuminated their boats, reminding them of all of their loved ones who had died in battle. Fu and her mother often prayed for her father. She'd never known him, as he died just before she was born, but she did know that he was a ninja who had fought in the war. "How about I get some fireflies too?" she pondered, rubbing his shell exactly where he liked it. Komiai snorted. "They're fragile, and die far too quickly. Stick to the ones you've already got." "I stuck some of my baby shirori on Mushimi yesterday," Fu grinned. "He kept scratching, and he didn't know why. He thinks he has lice now, and his uncle's furious." "Nice." Komiai wiggled his tail in his best impression of a thumbs up. When Fu's mother died when she was 7, her world suddenly grew ugly. Their house was too big for one girl, and as time passed by, mold and fungus crept into its cracks and it slowly fell into disrepair. It was alright in the summer, and there was always plenty of fish in the lake, so she never went hungry. But as the cold breeze of winter began licking at her toes, Fu realized that she would have to do something. After being refused by every repairman in the village, she tried to clear away the weeds and board up the holes herself, but it was beyond her. Nevertheless, she kept at it every day, licking her bruises where she'd hammered her own fingers instead of the wood as Komiai performed cheering routines in her head. It was one such winter evening that Gobuki, the village leader, approached her. He was a stern-faced man with dark hair. Fu knew that they were distantly related through her father, but he had never come near their house before, so the only times she had seen him were during the Firefly Festival. Unlike the rest of the village people, Gobuki wasn't cruel, but he was still a practical man who told her in matter-of-fact tones that Komiai was actually a monster that had been sealed inside her, and that she was expected to learn ninjutsu and use his powers to kill the village's enemies. "I don't want to kill people," said Fu, after thinking it over. Gobuki paused and looked at her oddly as he stroked his beard. Well, that's what you were born for. A lot of good ninjas sacrificed their lives capturing Komiai so it could be sealed in you. Not my fault, Komiai interjected in her head, making a rude gesture at Gobuki. Fu cocked her head to the side. Why me? Your mother offered you, Gobuki said flatly. Which I always found odd, considering your father was one of the ninja killed by Komiai. No, the world had never been as beautiful as she thought. And so, over the years, Fu trained under a variety of teachers who made little effort to contain their hatred for her. Grudgingly, they acknowledged that she was clever and a quick learner, but most abandoned their post after several months, unable to stand being in such constant contact with the village monster. Nevertheless, she mastered all the basic genin-level ninjutsu by the time she was 11. Then, working with Komiai, she began working to gain greater control over the Seven Tails' power until she could even begin to change form and adopt some of his capabilities. The first time she managed to project 2 scaly wings like Komiai's, heedless of the fact that it was nighttime and that she was exhausted, she flew up the guardian tree. Even with the temperature dropping rapidly, she flew higher up than she'd ever gone before, until she finally reached her peak. The view took her breath away. With wide eyes, Fu slowly took in the open canvas of the black sky, which reached endlessly out in every direction, ending only where it touched the expanse of dark forest that surrounded them. She'd never been able to see the sky properly before, because the treetops blocked so much of it. Raising a hand up, Fu marveled at how many of them there were. She hadn't realized that there were a million stars that hung like fireflies, lighting up a faraway world that was out of her reach. One day, when Gobuki had gone away on a secret mission, the village deputy who'd been left in charge summoned Fu. He was a thin, dark-skinned man named Hake with narrow, guarded eyes. Unlike Gobuki, he'd never hidden the fact that he despised the Taki Jinchuriki. He told her there would be a Chunin exam in Sunigakure in a week, and that she was to go there with one of the Taki team cells. Upon meeting her new teammates, Mushimi and Suzuru, Fu scowled. Mushimi, as she quickly recalled, had been one of her old tormentors. He was Hake's nephew, and he eyed her with intense loathing as soon as he laid eyes on her. As soon as she'd finished carefully inserting the last of her shirori and kabutomushi into a padded wooden tube which she then strapped to her back, Fu was whisked off to Sunigakure. As expected, the Chunin exams were a breeze. For the first exam, in which they had to break apart the opposing team's boulder, all she had to do was send over her cute little shirori at the opposing team to distract them, while simultaneously crawling into any cracks in the rock. With a stern order to her shirori to not eat the genin, their rocks soon fell apart and they passed. The next exam, Mushimi and Suzuru immediately abandoned her and ran off with their team plate, which was fine with her. The idiots of course got their team plate stolen by another team. She hunted and took back the team plate, and then with vindictive pleasure, frolicked around her tied-up teammates as they glared at her sullenly. She then burrowed inside a dead-end tunnel near the surface to take a nap, but accidentally mistimed it. Nevertheless, Komiai frantically shook her awake just in time to meet the exam's deadline. Despite that tiny mishap, the remainder of the exam was also going swimmingly, when something went wrong. Her preliminary went by in a flash afterwards. She couldn't even remember the names of her opponents. The AIM genin had gone down with little effort, but the other genin from Konoha had proved a little bit more tricky. She'd used a long-range medium for her, with irritating squawking blue birds that Fu had had to take great pains to avoid. But in the end, of course, it hadn't been a problem. After 2 weeks of loitering around while making sure her shirori and kabutomushi were breathing properly, her following match came, and it wasn't much of a challenge for her either. Her opponent was a Suna genin who seemed to have an extraordinary amount of pride in his puppet. Her shirori had just bred recently, and she'd been making sure to keep them extra hungry. Fu took great pleasure in seeing his horrified expression after having them eat up his puppet in a few seconds. In the final match, as it should have been, Fu faced off against the other most powerful genin in the exam. He was a red-headed boy from Konoha, with a tanto that must have been at least half his short height strapped across his back. But despite his disarmingly young appearance, the genin, Naruto, had been making waves in the Chunin exams as an especially dangerous opponent to watch out for. The battle had been going more or less in the direction she expected, when the boy suddenly slammed his tanto into the ground and electrocuted all of her insects. "No!" she screamed, her vision flashing red as she watched them blacken and shrivel up. In her mind's eye, she recalled with a flash her mother's eager face as she watched Fu unwrap her birthday present. "Komiai! You sure? He asked uncertainly, tail whipping around fretfully. I thought we'd agreed not to attract too much attention. But at her insistence, he reluctantly agreed, and she transformed into her initial Jinchuriki form before proceeding to pummel the brat into the ground where he belonged. Fu probably should have ended it there then, but she'd always had a rather nasty habit of playing with her fish before skewering them. The worn-out boy seemed to have given up all hope, and had just been lying still on the ground, his chest slowly rising up and down with every breath. To his credit, he did not seem altogether afraid. And then, Naruto! With some encouraging words from his teammate, the redhead was back on his feet with renewed strength in his eyes. Fu had been taken aback at first, watching with disbelief as it all happened, but she finally dove towards him with her hands outstretched. With her enhanced vision, she could see the artery in his neck pulsating. Just a single slash, and he'd be dead, and she'd have avenged her poor insects. There was something materializing in his hands. It was chakra, made so dense that it had become visible. Fu narrowed her eyes, but kept going. She was confident that there was no way it'd penetrate her hardened shell armor. They met each other head-on. Fu swiped at his neck, but he dodged. Nevertheless, she reached under his arms and lifted him off the ground. As she did so, she felt the ball of chakra he'd summoned slam into her torso. The impact was so powerful, the sand around her exploded up with a bang like massive waves, hiding them from the watching eyes of the audience. Gritting her teeth, Fu held on to his struggling body and streaked upwards to the sky. Letting out a hiss of pain, she felt the ball of chakra grind abrasively against her armor and begin to inch its way inwards to her flesh. With shock, she realized that her armor was cracking. Panting, Naruto determinedly continued to drive his hand against her. It was like a small contained storm that tore away at her shell as if it were made of paper. Before Fu could pass out from the pain, she dove, and just before they reached the ground, she released the boy. With another explosive crash, a shockwave of dust and sand swept through the arena. Gasping in agony, with blood dripping out through the gaping cracks of her armor, she soon dropped to the ground, her wings curled protectively around her. Black tendrils of unconsciousness began to creep upon her vision. When the sand had settled down, the match was over. Holding their breaths, the watching crowd quickly identified the victor. There was stunned silence. And then, the winner of the battle is Fu from Taki, the proctor announced, as shakily Fu got to her feet. At the other side of the arena, Naruto lay unmoving on the ground, his eyes closed. There was another long pause, and then the crowd rose to their feet, erupting into an uproarious round of applause. The Suna medics were already moving into the field with a stretcher, but a silver-haired jonin with a Konoha forehead protector, likely the boy's sensei, stopped them. Beside him stood the girl who'd interrupted their battle. Come to think of it, she was the same girl who'd been a headache to deal with in the preliminaries. Fu couldn't quite place her name. She was white-faced as she followed the jonin, but just as they knelt beside the redhead genin, he stirred and opened his eyes. Naruto, said the girl, looking quite relieved as she threw her arms around the dazed boy. Ow, he winced, and she immediately let go, apologizing. The jonin asked him a few questions, to which Naruto shook his head no. Waving away the stretcher, the jonin and the girl helped him get up. Silently, Fu watched as they hobbled out of the arena together. What's wrong? Komi asked, sensing something was off. Nothing, she said, feeling a lump in her throat. Komi, you saw what happened with his sudden chakra surge. Do you think that kid is a Jinchuriki like me? Everyone knows Konoha got their hands on Per Kurama, Komi said contemplatively. Though we don't know who the vessel is right now. It's not unthinkable. Fu cocked her head, her brow furrowed. But his teammates don't hate him. Maybe he has a better personality than you, Komi offered. With the help of several brave, but wary Suna medic Nin, Fu was soon patched up. Wincing as they healed her with the soothing blue glow of medical ninjutsu, she noticed Suzuru skulking around the bleachers. Oddly enough, however, Mushimi had disappeared. Even after scanning the entire stadium, she couldn't find him. She'd been half expecting an abrasive rebuke about her entering her Jinchuriki form. With a shrug, Fu stopped thinking about it. After an hour, the Chunin certification ceremony was held. All of the genins, having been more or less restored to a conscious state, stood in line before the Kazakage, who gave another boring speech about the honor that the title of Chunin held and the duty they owed their villages. And then, the names of the passing genin were called. Fu from Taki, said the Kazekage, glaring out at her from under his green-pointed kage hat. Hopping up, she collected her Chunin certificate of achievement to polite applause. Rolling it up immediately, she stuffed it in her strap. Uzumaki Naruto from Konohagakure. No surprises there. Looking much recovered, the red-headed genin walked up and accepted his certificate. Kankuro from Sunigakure. This time, the Kazekage's face eased up just a bit as he looked down at his son. With a pat on his shoulder, the boy accepted his certificate with a bow to enthusiastic applause. Hyuga Niji from Konohagakure. With a blank expression on his face, the boy took the certificate and walked away without any further response. And so on and so forth. 3 more genin were awarded the certificate, 2 from Amigakure, and another one from Konohagakure. The Konoha boy, who had a scar running down his face, looked stunned as he walked up to receive his certificate. But as soon as the paper was in his hand, and he'd examined it to make sure that it was real, the boy began jumping up and down in excitement. As he distastefully watched the boy holler, the look on the Kazekage's face made it clear that he was beginning to regret his decision. To end the ceremony, a row of Suna Jonin performed some impressive tricks with air, making fountains out of sparkling sand and giant structures that towered over them. And then, just as the sun was beginning to set, it was finally over. With an air of shooing the strangers out of their village, the Kazekage dismissed them all and disappeared. It was then that Mushimi finally appeared. Pocketing something that jangled in his pouch, he exchanged a meaningful glance with Suzuru. Then, turning to Fu with a scowl, he motioned towards the village gates with a jerking gesture. And so, they left Sunigakure. As they began the long trek across the sand dunes back to their village, Fu couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Mushimi and Suzuru seemed to be avoiding her gaze even more so than usual. Tense, and sweating profusely, they looked around every now and then, as if expecting something. She glanced around at their surroundings, but all she could see was sand. "Something's up," said Fu, eyeing the boys in question. "I agree," said Komiai. However, despite their unease, nothing happened the first day. But on the second day, just as they were nearing the border between Fire Country, Fu sensed them. As she realized that she was being watched, her senses grew hyper-alert. Without stopping, she began to pick up her pace, and soon, she had left her teammates behind. Her heart pounding, she raced across the tree branches of the heavily dense woodland. Suddenly, with a blur, a figure landed directly in front of her, blocking her way. Fu came to a stop. "Hold up there, kid." The man had slicked back silver hair, and was dressed in a long black cloak with red clouds and a chin-high collar. Fu's eyes darted to the blood-red scythe he held in his hand, and snarled, "What do you want with me?" "Honestly?" The man seemed to genuinely think it over, though his purple eyes never strayed from her face. A gruesome smile lit up his face. "I want to offer you to my god, and by that I mean I want to tear your face up with my scythe, and feel your agony as I rip through your nerves, cell by cell, reveling in your every." "Shut up and do your job, newbie." A gruff voice joined in. Fu spun around in shock to see a tall man in a similar black cloak, with a black mask covering much of his face. He wore a Taki forehead protector, but there was a slash running straight across the middle. Taking in his bizarre appearance, Fu knew for sure that she had never seen him before in her life. As she watched, the tall man tossed something to the side, and it took a second for Fu to process what it was. When she realized, she jerked back in alarm. Mushimi and Suzuru's decapitated heads, still dripping blood at the base of their necks, stared back at her with shocked, glassy eyes. "Not that I care," said the purple-eyed man, "but I thought we made a deal with them?" "They had only half the money they promised," growled the tall man. He turned his pupil-less green eyes towards Fu, who took a step back. "Let's show them what we can do, Komiai," she said, ignoring the trembling in her legs. After a long, hard day of traveling, they had finally left behind the deserts of Wind Country, and were at the edges of Fire Country. However, with still a half-day's journey left from Konoha, they had set up camp for the night. After a satisfying dinner with some prairie chickens they caught, and then roasted over the campfire, Rai and Mayu finally collapsed in exhaustion. Sporadically mumbling words like "I passed," and "I'm a Chunin." In his sleep, Rai snored away on the grassy ground. Next to him, Mayu dozed in her sleeping bag with a peaceful look on her face. And occasionally stoking the campfire with a stick, Kakashi read a book by the fire's light. Unable to fall asleep, Naruto reclined on top of a nearby boulder that was covered with light fuzz of moss, looking up at the night sky. Tomorrow, they will be back in Konoha. Naruto was just as happy as the others to finally leave behind the bleak, endless sandy plains of Sunagakure, but he didn't know how he felt about returning to their home village. He didn't want to see any of their faces. He didn't know if he could ever forgive what they'd done to him. His entire life, they'd lied to him but still subjected him to their hatred and ridicule. They'd never even given him a chance to figure things out for himself, controlling him by tying him down with the taboo seal, as if he were nothing but a senseless, rabid beast. If Konoha could do that to an ignorant, innocent child, what did the village ideals he'd always believed in even signify? The will of fire was taught to every child, whether civilian or shinobi born, as a symbol of peace and compassion, but it had never seemed to extend towards him. Naruto supposed most of them had never even thought of him as one of them. His hands curled into fists by his side. That was fine with him. He no longer cared about them either. Or at least, he'd try not to. However, he gazed down at the sleeping figures of his teammates. The look on Mayu's face as she looked down upon him in the arena had been completely different from anything he'd seen before. There had been no fear, no disgust. There had been only trust, and an unwavering belief in him. And then in a bolt of realization, Kakashi-sensei's words had flashed through his mind. So you're saying your efforts were all to get people to acknowledge you? That doesn't sound like the Naruto I know. Naruto hadn't responded then, but at that moment, his answer had been suddenly clear in his mind. He hadn't been striving all those years to hear praise from faceless villagers who spat at him. He'd been doing his best to stand out for that one day when anyone noticed him. Not as Naruto the village pariah, or Naruto the Jinchuriki, but as Naruto the Konoha ninja. He had wanted the strength to protect them. But in chasing after that dream, he'd gotten so caught up in its mechanics that he hadn't even realized that he was already surrounded by people who saw him for himself. Naruto turned to look at the sleeping forms of his teammates. They didn't know, of course, that he had the 9 tails trapped inside of him. Kakashi-sensei had told him that they would be going directly to the Hokage as soon as they returned to Konoha, but that until then, nobody else was to find out. How would they react? Rai's words, from back when they were in the deep underground caves of Suna, swam hauntingly around in his head. I guess you already know that you were born on the day of the 9 tails attack. My parents were killed on that day. Naruto's heart sank. Surely they would realize that Naruto wasn't the 9 tails itself? That he was just an unwilling vessel for the beast that had killed their loved ones? Struggling to contain the raging thoughts in his head, Naruto sighed. Letting his head fall back against the moss-covered rock, he looked up at the star-filled sky. Raising a hand, he stared at the outline of his hand. Several hundreds of feet away, tucked in the shadows of the surrounding forest, a solitary figure in a long black cloak with red cloud motifs silently observed the campsite. His face was obscured by an orange mask that spiraled inwards, opening up into an eye hole on his right. Ignoring the 2 sleeping genin completely, his red gaze lingered on the jonin for a second before resting on the red-headed genin who lay awake. The figure stood completely still, watching. He watched as the genin eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. He watched the jonin sleep, periodically waking up to stoke the campfire. For hours he watched and watched. Then, there was a hiss and then a distorted flickering in his consciousness. We've got the Jinchuriki, a voice spoke in his head telepathically. We're beginning the extraction process now. Finally, he roused himself. With one last look at the sleeping ninja, he turned to leave, stepping on a leaf as he did so. At the faint sound, the silver-haired jonin's eyes immediately snapped open, and getting up with a start, the man peered with narrowed eyes at where the figure had been silently watching. But there was nobody there. He was gone now, but he would keep watching. He was always watching. After several days of nothingness, Fu suddenly realized that she had been given bodily form once more. She was floating in a pitch-black world. There was nothing around her, above her, or below her. But somehow she was there. She felt weak and tired, and even though she had just awakened, she wanted nothing more than to go back to sleep. With a jolt, she realized that it was eerily quiet where she was. She couldn't remember the last time it had been so quiet. Where was Komiai? Komiai? Fu called out softly, taking a step forward. Despite there being nothing there, her foot held in the blackness, so she took another step forward. Komiai? She kept calling out his name, but he never answered. After some time, Fu finally realized that he wasn't there. She was the only person there. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. You know, I really wanted those fireflies, she whispered into the darkness. But of course, nobody responded. Fu closed her eyes, and everything faded away. Chapter 17, A Will Inherited. The last time Naruto had had a private audience with the Hokage, he was 6 years old. The Hokage's office had seemed immense to him then, and the Hokage himself had been an alien, untouchable figure. But as he stood before the desk once more, the room, though big, was contained, and the man had never looked as weary as he did now. So you know the truth now, said the Hokage quietly, getting straight to the point. He was seated behind his desk. The white hat that signified his status cast shadows over his lined face. Yes, Naruto said simply, remaining stiffly in his standing position. Kakashi has filled me in on what he's told you, including the fact that he has suppressed the taboo seal. But there are still certain things that he has wisely decided not to tell you, or perhaps he has forgotten them himself. With his wrinkled fingers steepled against each other on the desk, the Hokage looked straight at Naruto. For the village, I sacrificed your childhood. You must despise me. I don't know how I feel, said Naruto, slightly taken aback by the man's directness despite himself. All I know is that the fourth Hokage was the one who sealed the 9 tails within me. And for this, all the villagers hate me. Kakashi-sensei told me that there was an accident when I was 6, but I recall that I was unwanted even before then. Even I still do not quite understand what happened the night the 9 tails attacked Konoha, said the Hokage heavily. But Naruto, did you know that Konoha has controlled the 9 tails for several generations now? You are not our first Jinchuriki. We had 2 before you and they were both Uzumaki's as well. Naruto's eyes widened by a margin. Yes, your mother, Uzumaki Kushina, was the Jinchuriki before you. Naruto paused. My mother. And the one single thing that most weakens a Jinchuriki seal, that is, a Jinchuriki's most vulnerable, natural state, is when she is giving birth. The Hokage nodded at Naruto's surprised expression. Yes, your mother risked quite a lot when she became pregnant with you. I thought Minato would be able to suppress it, but somehow it escaped. I suspect there was a third party, but we've never found any leads in that investigation. Regardless, in the aftermath, Minato and Kushina both sacrificed their lives to seal it once more within you. His face darkened. Unfortunately, the majority of the village was not aware that Kushina was pregnant. For her and your safety, Minato and Kushina kept her pregnancy a secret. And so, to this day, they still do not understand how it escaped. I believe some people who were not familiar with Kushina may have actually believed that she had released the 9 tails itself. What? Naruto cut in, his brow furrowed in thought. Why did you keep it a secret after they died then? Why not tell everyone that I was their son, and that it wasn't her fault? I may be Hokage, but even I do not have the power to control people's hearts, said the Hokage heavily. Fear and prejudice are powerful forces. Following Minato's wishes, the surname Namikaze was widely feared across the nations, and may have instigated assassination attempts against you were given your mother's name, Uzumaki. With you being a newly born red-haired infant, and having the last name Uzumaki, I'm sure anyone could have connected the dots. But inevitably, rumors were spread. You would not be able to tell given Konoha's present prosperity, but back then, it was a time of great loss and uncertainty. Many people had died, and the great fourth Hokage had even given his life to defeat the beast. It is unfortunate, but people who are grieving do not always look to reason, and you become an outlet for their pain. It didn't help that even some of the shinobi themselves held preconceived notions about Jinchuriki, helping to set off what would soon become a village-wide movement against Naruto. The Hokage paused. You may not have been aware of it, but I always had at least 2 of my ANBU watch over you during your childhood. It was rare, but there were times they had to step in to prevent any bodily harm from happening to you. I remember, Naruto said quietly, thinking back to the time when the ANBU had scooped him up from inside his apartment. And yet, why didn't I step in? The Hokage mused out loud, as if reading Naruto's mind. Why didn't I act as a grandfatherly figure towards you? Why did I seal your memories? Naruto nodded mutely. When you were just an infant, I put you in the care of an ANBU retiree, your caretaker. I had resumed my duties as the village's Hokage, and there were many things to take care of. I was incredibly busy, but regardless, I checked on you every now and then. You must not remember me, but it was I who bought you your first book, a book of folk tales. And Kakashi was there as well. He carved you a set of wooden blocks. This may very well have continued in this pattern, if another incident hadn't happened. Right before you turned 6, an anonymous organization somehow received intel on you, and sent a squad to infiltrate the village and kidnap you. You were able to release some of the Nine Tails' power, and you slaughtered them, but you lost control, and in the process, killed several ninja who were at the scene as well, including your caretaker. His mouth turned dry as he rewound his memories back to the morning he had woken up on his 6th birthday to a cold, empty room. There was an immediate backlash. Civilians and ninja alike believed this only confirmed their worst fear, that the Nine Tails was taking over your consciousness and would eventually be released once more. The most radical of them wanted you to be put down, but they had to be appeased with the application of a taboo seal, which effects I believe Kakashi informed you on. The Hokage's eyes swept over Naruto's tersely set jaw and whitened knuckles, and gave a slight nod. Your feelings of anger are to be expected. Even at such a young age, you had set yourself apart as a gifted child, much like your father once was. And it is clear now, from the level of self-mastery you displayed during the Chunin exams, that if we had informed you of your situation and taught you to control the Nine Tails, you would have succeeded. Yet, we treated you as an ignorant child, no, as an animal, pushing you back and forth at our slightest whims. I cannot foresee the future. I had personally inspected Minato's seal, but there were certain elements that had never been used in a Jinchuriki seal before. Knowing Minato as I did, I knew he would not have made a mistake, but there was always a feeling of unease whenever I saw you. Your red hair was a trademark of the Uzumaki clan, and your whisker-like birthmarks were a result of your receiving your mother's influence while in her womb, but at the same time, you seemed like the very image of a Nine Tails that had been reborn incarnate. And so, I gave in to the fears of an aging, feeble mind. I see that I have given you much to think about. That is all I have to say, unless you have further questions, but all I ask is that you not blame the tool that carries out the hand's bidding. You may hate me as you wish, but I hope that you will keep considering Konoha your home. The villagers have not treated you fairly. They have trampled and spat on you when they should have loved and raised you as one of their own. But believe me when I say that their actions were not out of malice for you. They were a result of fear and uncertainty, a lack of belief in those that had died for the village. However, from having personally looked over your growth through such difficulty, I can now say with a sincere heart that I believe you have the strength to overcome this. The Hokage stopped for a second to bore his gaze into Naruto's. You must have known this for a long time now, but I have only just realized you are stronger than I had once thought. While I had once seen the Nine Tails in your red hair, all I see in it now is the will of fire that burns within you. I see, said Naruto, carefully keeping his face blank. Then there is just one question I'd like to ask, Hokage-sama. It was the Hokage's turn to blink. Clearly, he had been expecting more of a reaction. What seal did my father use on me, and how much control do I have over it? The Hokage slowly nodded. Minato sealed the Nine Tails within you using the 8 trigram seal, which is a special kind of seal that allows the vessel to access the chakra of the contained beast. The Hokage paused. I do not believe your father intended it to be a curse, Naruto. Did you know that at one point, Minato was considered the child of a prophecy, and fated to change the world? Jeriah certainly thought so. However, I believe that Minato thought that it would be you, rather, who would revolutionize this world. And so, he left you this power in order to have the ability to do so. Following the talk, the taboo seal was quickly and discreetly removed. It was a brief affair. Bearing the back of his neck to the Hokage, the man made a twisting motion with an outstretched hand. There was a flash of white pain, and then there was nothing. Immediately, Naruto could feel the difference. As if a tightly contained, dense fog had suddenly been vacuumed away, the block in his mind disappeared, revealing the large tunnel he had seen earlier. For now, Naruto decided he would hold himself back from exploring it. The Hokage had warned him not to hurtle headfirst into the newly discovered sections of his memory. The influx of lost memories could confuse and overwhelm his brain and lead to possible complications. It would be better for him to let them return on their own over time. Piece by piece, they would fall naturally back into place. As for the Nine Tails itself, Naruto hadn't yet decided how to more formally approach it. According to the Hokage's explanation, he should be able to access its chakra, but just from his brief impromptu interaction with it during the exam, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The sun was just beginning to set when Naruto finally returned to his apartment and lay face down on his bed. Contrary to the carefully composed blank mask he'd presented to the Hokage, his mind was still caught up in a whirlwind of questions and indecision. He did not know what to believe. He had accepted the Hokage's explanation as sincere, but that did not mean he had to like it. Typical of a doting father, the Hokage had tried to cover for his ignorant children's behavior, but Naruto no longer needed their approval. Speaking of fathers, it was still hard to take in that the legendary fourth Hokage was his. And contrary to how Naruto had perceived it as a child, it had not been his father but his mother who'd been his connection to the Uzumaki clan. He had first felt betrayed that his parents had been the ones to seal the 9 tails inside of him, but the realization that his mother had been the Jinchuriki before him took some of the sting away. The Hokage had also said that his father had hoped he would be able to harness the 9 tails' power for the sake of the world and by extension, the village. Whether or not that was true, the Hokage had been laying it on a bit thick near the end. He didn't care about any of that, or the will of fire. Why should he have the desire to believe, cherish and fight for the villagers when they would never do the same back for him? Naruto shifted his grudging body around and looked up at the empty ceiling. What he did want was to become strong, however strong enough to be able to protect the people he did care about. The skies outside were dark when Naruto restlessly jumped to his feet and left the apartment. Wandering about through the marketplace, which bustled with activity in the dinner rush, ignoring the looks, as always, that some of the passing villagers were giving him, he found his feet automatically moving him toward the direction of Ichiraku's, from which emanated the rich, heavy smell of ramen. Lifting the entrance flap, he saw a flash of silver as one of the sitting customers turned around to look at him. Hesitating for a brief second, Naruto made his way past the rowdy crowd and sat next to its source. "So a miso pork ramen, large, extra garlic? The usual?" asked Ichiraku's owner, hanging over the counter. Despite the hubbub, he always seemed to be able to spot Naruto's telltale red hair. "Yes, please." "Ah, that's what I forgot." From beside him, Kakashi leaned his masked face against his hand. "Extra garlic on mine too, Tochi." "Coming right up," said the man, returning his attention to the boiling metal pots before him. As they waited for their food, they sat there quietly, letting the outside conversations wash over them like white noise. And when their ramen bowls were set before them, they tucked in, making sure to slurp loud enough for the Ichiraku owner to hear. Only once both bowls were cleared and their stomachs verging on uncomfortably full, did Naruto finally speak up. "What did you think of my final match, sensei?" said Kakashi distractedly, putting his book down. "Ah yes, that was an interesting move you did back then, Naruto. You might have gotten her too if you didn't slip up there at the end." "So you noticed," Naruto nodded. "I'd thought about it in theory, but I hadn't actually tried it before then. It was harder than I thought it'd be. What I did was, I made my chakra." "You made it dense to give it power, spun it in multiple directions to give it rotation, and then merged it together to give it stability. And you messed up at the stability step. Am I right?" Naruto blinked, and Kakashi let out a small chuckle. "Believe it or not, you're not the first person to have thought of that, Naruto. It's called the Rasengan. I'm curious though, what did you think of it?" "That time back in Yugakure, when you used your Raikiri, it helped me realize that there's more to than hand seals," said Naruto. "It gave me the idea of channeling a certain amount of chakra to a certain area of the body to enhance its function, and for someone like me with excessive chakra stores, I knew I could somehow utilize the destructive power of pure chakra. Though I see now that it's harder than I thought it'd be to keep it under control." "I can teach you how to better stabilize it," said Kakashi, looking at Naruto. "If you'll let me." Naruto could sense the second question that lingered unspoken in the air, but he had already made up his mind. "Yes, sensei." "All right then," said Kakashi with a nod. "We'll get started right away. Meet me at Field B tomorrow at 7 am. Sharp." With a clatter of his chair, Kakashi got up to leave, tucking his precious book into a pouch on his side. Naruto regarded him skeptically. "So you mean noon?" "A ninja always keeps his word, Naruto." Ichiraku's owner cleared his throat meaningfully. "Is that why you're leaving me the bill?" Naruto asked dryly. "I only treat cute little genin. You're a Chunin now, you're one of them big boys. But you know, it's interesting." Kakashi looked thoughtful. "What is?" he asked, despite himself. Did you know that the fourth was the one who invented the Rasengan? Through his mask, Kakashi smiled at Naruto's dumbfounded expression before disappearing in a swirl of leaves. It was a cold evening that day in Konoha. The last lights of the marketplace had expired, and the remaining stragglers of the night had turned in for the night. The only movements came from the moonlight reflecting off the slightly tilting masks of the ANBU that watched over the unsuspecting village from the tiled rooftops. From below their anonymous masks, their breath came out in white wisps that quickly faded in the night air. At the base of the Hokage mountain was the Hokage's office. Heedless of the late hour, two figures stood stiffly in the dimly lit room. One was the Hokage, dressed in the white robes of his office as usual. The other was a tall, elderly man with bandages covering half his face. The way they stood was familiar, but tense. They had known each other for a very long time now, but their relationship had grown colder over the years as the difference in their opinions of how matters should be dealt had increasingly diverged. "So you told the Jinchuriki the truth," said Danzo coolly. Hiruzen tiredly folded his hands together. Naruto already knew the truth. I owed him an explanation of it at the very least. "What do you owe a Jinchuriki?" Danzo scoffed. "That was foolish of you. What if he turns against us?" "He won't," said Hiruzen. "My sources tell me the boy isn't the type to be won over with flattery and praise." "No, but underneath all of that, he is still just a boy." Hiruzen turned his head to look out the window at the Hokage monument. From where he stood, it was so close he could see the cracks along the carved mountainside. "He gets along with his team, and Kakashi will treat him well. That's why I put him there. And ultimately, Konoha is his home, regardless of how he has been treated. He won't so easily turn his back on it." "We'll see." With an expressionless look on his face and a curt nod of his head, Danzo left. Hiruzen watched his departure with calculating eyes. He could tell Danzo was up to something again. He would have to keep a closer eye on him whenever the man got that look on his face. Something unexpected inevitably happened. Folding his hands behind his back, Hiruzen slowly walked over to the window on the other side of his office. From there, he could look out over the entirety of the village. It always filled his heart with warmth to see the civilians going about their daily activities, the ninja rushing around to hand in their missions or slack off at Ichiraku's, the children at the academy sparring with sweat on their brow. His gaze alighted on one particular rooftop. Its inhabitant was likely sleeping right now, but Hiruzen knew him to be one of the most gifted and hard-working genin, now Chunin, in the village. In any other circumstance, the boy would have been widely praised and acknowledged for his genius and resourcefulness, but fate had not been kind to him. And yet, even so, he persevered. For the most part, Hiruzen hadn't lied to Danzo about Naruto. But there was one thing that he had said for the sole purpose of easing Danzo's paranoia, and that was that Naruto was just a boy. But he wasn't just a boy. Hiruzen may have been exaggerating at certain points at the time, but he hadn't been lying when he told Naruto that he saw a fire in him. At the moment, it was contained but smoldering. Given time, he could see it turn into a great bonfire. He wondered though, was it really the will of fire? Or was it something else? Chapter 18, Day of Departure. Huff huff. His lungs felt like they were on fire and his vision was starting to blur, but the man, gritting his teeth, continued to leap across the tree branches. Dark-toned and dressed in nondescript black clothes, he blended almost perfectly into the darkness of the night. The only thing that gave him away was the frayed scroll clutched in his hands that gleamed white under the stray rays of moonlight that interrupted the shade of the forest canopy. His heart thudding loudly in his chest, as sweat streamed down his face, the man cautiously looked behind him. He was alone. Letting out a tiny sigh of relief, the man felt some of the tension leaving his muscles. As the hot blood coursing through his veins began to slow down, he suddenly realized that the wind blowing strongly against his face was cold. At the thought, he slightly lowered his pace, letting himself catch his breath. The rumors were true then. Konohagakure's security, once renowned as an impassable steel wall that blocked out all intruders, was no longer what it used to be. The past 15 years had not been kind to the village after all. Their most famous trio, the Sannin, had left the village, and in the invasion of the Nine Tails, they'd lost their Yondaime Hokage, leaving behind the increasingly decrepit Sandaime to try and rebuild the village. He looked around, but there was still nothing, besides the occasional rustling of squirrels and birds lower down. His lips edged up in a triumphant smile. For a man past his prime, the Sandaime hadn't done such a shabby job, but the village's strength was nowhere near what it had been at its peak. He hadn't even been questioned at the village entrance. The Chunin on gate duty had glanced at him once, and then waved him in. Breaking into the archives had been just as easy, using a simple to trick the Chunin at the desk into thinking he'd already left, and then slipping out just as the guards changed shifts. However, despite how smoothly the operation was going, the man had still grown antsy. He was in a ninja village after all, regardless of how much it had fallen from its former glory, and almost slipped up when he was leaving the village. Just as he stepped into line behind several civilians at the exit gate, the entrance gate had creaked open to allow another stream of people in, and then the on-duty Chunin raised a hand in greeting. Another successful mission? Good job. I didn't do much this time, said a deep voice. Sure. Hokage-sama wants you in his office right away, Kakashi. Got it. At the sound of the infamous name, the man had frozen. Could it be the copy ninja himself? And slowly turned his head to see. When he saw the infamous silver hair and eight draped over the left eye, he swore to himself. He knew the mission had been going far too easily. It had only been a matter of time for an unexpected setback. But it was just his luck to run into one of Konoha's most famous jonin right as he was about to leave. Forcing himself to stay calm, he looked away. His eyes landing on a shorter red-headed boy beside the jonin, his pounding heartbeat had slowly grown steadier. However, the boy must have felt his gaze, for he looked up and locked eyes with him, and for a second, he could have sworn that the boy knew exactly what he was and why he was there. But as the man felt a cold bead of sweat drip from his temple, the boy then looked away. The duo passed by, and the Chunin waved him out, and he was home free. Despite his success, he'd felt uneasy after seeing the copy ninja right under his nose, and he booked it as soon as the walls were out of sight. But now, it seemed that truly nobody in the village had noticed his intrusion. And even if they did find out, it was too late now to catch up to him, since he'd taken care even in his haste to cover up his tracks. The mission had been a success then. Jubilantly, the man looked down at the scroll in his hand. It contained some of Konoha's forbidden techniques, an increasingly valuable commodity in the black market if you knew where to look. His target was a group slowly growing in infamy, called the Akatsuki, that had been buying out all such village forbidden techniques at prices above their competition. If he sold it to them at a good price, he'd be able to settle his debts with enough to spare. Maybe with the extra money, he'd drop by the hot springs at Yugakure. He'd heard there'd been an incident there a year or two ago, but things had been quiet since then. Surely it'd be safe now? And the food and the service there were always so good. Lots of good-looking women too. Suddenly, something heavy smashed into the back of the man's neck, and unable to react, he buckled. He'd been mid-jump, so he felt his body hang momentarily in the air before it began to limply free fall to the ground. As everything turned fuzzy and his vision faded into blackness, the last thing he saw was something red streak over him. Naruto had just turned over the unconscious outsider to the intelligence division, when a triumphant cry rang out from behind him. Turning around, he was greeted with an excited-looking Rai skidding to a stop before him. At the sight of his teammate, Naruto raised a critical eyebrow. In the 2 weeks they hadn't seen each other, it looked like the boy had again added at least another inch to his height. After they passed the exam, Rai, like him, had switched to more standard ninja attire, complete with a flak jacket and in the other newly minted Chunin's case, a pair of bladed weapons strapped across his back. However, as the months passed by, the already tall boy had hit yet another growth spurt, and now towered over Naruto, who, despite his best efforts, could still pass for an academy student playing dress-up. I saw Kakashi-sensei just a few minutes ago, Rai said as a means of greeting, glancing curiously at the Chunin taking away the body. He told me I'd find you here. We're wanted at the Hokage's office. Nodding in affirmation, Naruto began to briskly head down the mostly empty street towards the village center. Trotting along easily by his side, Rai looked around discreetly, and then lowered his head. So that's another B-rank mission done in record time? He whispered conspiratorially, a hand raised to cover his mouth. I wasn't aware there was a record to be broken, Naruto answered absently, as he took mental inventory of his remaining equipment. Oh, you don't know? Pulling back, Rai rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The younger Chunin keep a running bet on how much time some of the longer missions will take. The general consensus was that it'd take you and Kakashi-sensei at least 3 weeks to finish that mission with the Fire Lord's treasurer, but I had faith in you guys. You put money on us, didn't you? Said Naruto amusedly. Rai grinned gleefully, and held up 2 fingers in a victory pose. I'll need those winnings if I don't want to be cleaned out, what with celebrating Mayu's promotion and all. You're still celebrating? Naruto raised his eyebrows. They'd received news of her passing the Chunin exam just before he had left for his most recent mission. We didn't even start. We can't exactly celebrate without the entire Team 7, now can we? Rai waved a hand dismissively. Naruto felt the corners of his mouth quirk upwards. That's true. Smiling came easier to Naruto nowadays. He'd have thought that with knowing the truth, or at least some of it, his situation would have grown more difficult, but on the contrary, life had proceeded fairly normally afterwards. Or as normal as life could get for a ninja with the 9 tails sealed inside him, anyways. Naruto wasn't winning any popularity contests, and he wasn't surprised that he hadn't known about the Chunin's betting games, for most of them tended to keep their distance from him. But both Rai and Mayu's relaxed attitude towards him had helped to ease some of the misgivings their new comrades may have had toward him. Their fellow Chunin didn't include him, but they didn't go out of their way to bother him, and that was all he wanted. His training sessions with Kakashi were also going, for the most part, as smoothly as one could expect, while repeatedly materializing highly dense quantities of chakra on a regular basis. He'd been able to stabilize the Rasengan to the extent that it didn't drain him, and had even begun experimenting with adding his elemental chakra to the mix, something which, according to Kakashi, the 4th Hokage had never had the time to complete himself. But there was still an ever-present weight at the back of his mind. While it had been over a year since Naruto had had his taboo seal removed, he had yet to regain any of his memories of the purported incident when he was 6. The few memories he'd lost in the Chunin exams had returned, but his 6th birthday was still a huge blank. Nor had he regained any other memories in between, meaning that they were either so insignificant that he hadn't noticed, that nothing had actually happened, or even worse, that they hadn't come back yet. Kakashi had tried to reassure him, confirming that the seal had really been removed, and that the memories would eventually return in the course of time. Still, it was unsettling, not knowing for sure whether his own memories were complete or not. Naruto glanced at Rai, who was now silently walking along with his arms crossed behind his head. There was also the matter of his teammates still not knowing about his Jinchuriki status. The problem was, he never found the time to do so. Ever since he'd been promoted to Chunin, his daily routine had become a never-ending cycle between training and missions. His remaining time was barely enough for him to sleep, eat, and carry out other basic necessities. With Rai also busy with his new Chunin duties and Mayu practicing hard for the next exam, the chance to bring up such a sensitive topic had just never come around. A small voice whispered to him that if he'd really wanted to, he could always turn down 1 or 2 missions and make time, but Naruto quickly quashed it. When they were let into the Hokage's office, Naruto was not surprised to find the 2 remaining members of Team 7 already waiting for them. Mayu, glowing in her new Chunin attire, and Kakashi, still in his dusty travel clothes, stood beside a pale black-haired Chunin he had never seen before. "Ah, Naruto," Rai said the Hokage, lowering a smoking pipe from his wrinkled mouth. "Good, you're all here now." The 2 bowed shortly in the elder shinobi's direction. Raising his head, Rai curiously stared at the strange Chunin. "You wanted us, Hokage-sama? I realize you've just returned from a long mission." As he spoke, the Hokage nodded at Kakashi and Naruto in turn. "However, with tension escalating between nation borders right now, client requests are at a peak and our manpower stretched thin. I've spoken to Kakashi and he's agreed to accept this next mission. But if you'd like some rest, Naruto, I am willing to let you sit out on this next mission." "That will be unnecessary, Hokage-sama," said Naruto immediately. The mission had been long but tedious, and he still had plenty of energy left over. With Kakashi and his teammates gone, he'd have little to do in Konoha by himself, anyways. At his response, the Hokage leaned back in his chair with a contemplative look on his face. "Very well then. I've got here an urgent mission that will require you all to start out by early morning tomorrow. Naruto, Mayu and Rai, you 3 will be teaming up with another Chunin on a B-rank bodyguard mission to Wave Country." "Wait, what about Kakashi-sensei?" Rai cut in, looking put out. The Hokage passed a smoking pipe to his hand. Kakashi is being sent on another mission into Earth Country. On this mission, Naruto will be your team leader. A Jonin standing beside the Hokage stepped forward to hand them their mission scrolls. Unfurling his, Naruto quickly scanned the contents. It was short but clear. It was a standard escort mission that had earned B rank simply due to the fact that the client was a semi-well-known merchant. Considering the current smuggling situation with Gato in Wave Country, it wouldn't be unexpected for the client to be targeted by minor bandits and ruffians on the journey. It was nothing any properly trained ninja couldn't handle, but dangerous for civilian travelers on the road, thus warranting the recent rise in demands for bodyguards. Naruto glanced at the wan-faced Chunin standing beside Kakashi. The boy, dressed in all black with a tanto strapped across his back, looked only 1 or 2 years older than him, but Naruto had never seen him in the academy before. Is that the Chunin we'll be teaming up with? Indeed, this is Sai, the Hokage said, with a simple gesture towards the boy, whose face split into a wide smile. Its intended purpose may have been to disarm, but to Naruto, it looked more eerie and offsetting than anything. Hiya, said Sai, with a wave. Turning to Mayu, he held out a hand. So you must be Mayu, was it? With a shy nod, Mayu raised her hand. His smile grew even bigger. Wow, you've got a really forgettable face, don't you? Mayu froze. Snarling something incomprehensible, Rai took a step forward, but stopped when Naruto firmly grabbed his arm. You must be Naruto, said Sai, turning to him with a look of delight. Looking forward to working with you, short stuff. Naruto let go of Rai. After a beat, he stepped forward to grip the other boy's hand. Likewise. After receiving a few more mission details from the Hokage, they began to all file out of the room, when the Hokage cleared his throat. Naruto. He paused. Mayu and Rai stopped as well, but the Hokage shook his head. I'd like to talk to him privately for a minute. Once the door had clicked shut, Naruto turned to the elder shinobi. Yes, Hokage-sama? You may be wondering why I'm sending you without Jonin's supervision. Naruto nodded. It's only been a year since you became a Chunin, but your name has come up several times for a Jonin appointment. Your skills certainly would match up well. The only thing you're missing is experience in leading missions, as you've always been paired with Kakashi. So I'm putting you in charge of the other 3. This should be a good learning experience for you. Understood, Hokage-sama. Naruto wasn't surprised, and in fact, welcomed the promotion. Being a Jonin would mean he would get more challenging missions, have higher clearance in the archives, and best of all, he wouldn't have to report to anyone besides the Hokage. Naturally, my council is not pleased with my decision to grant you more autonomy, but they've grudgingly acknowledged your good work this past year. However, they pushed me to add this side to your team, and I saw no reason to deny them, but I want you to always be aware that his role is to be their watchdog and to report back to them anything he learns about you. I assume you know what this means. Yes, sir. Clearly, the Hokage wanted Naruto to gather information on Sai at the same time he was being observed. Lastly, I sent Team Shirakumo to Wave Country just yesterday, so if you do run into trouble, you should find friendly faces at a reachable distance. Don't let your pride stop you from taking advantage of that. Yes, sir, said Naruto slowly. With a satisfied nod from the Hokage, he was dismissed. Turning sharply around on his heel, he left the room. Walking down the empty hallway, his thoughts turned to the journey that lay before him. It would be his first long-distance mission without Kakashi. He wasn't nervous about whether he was up for it, since the Jonin had always preferred to take the back seat and let Naruto handle most of the dirty work. But it was a little strange to realize that this time around, if he somehow mishandled things, his teacher wouldn't be around to clean up after him. Naruto frowned, clenching his hands tightly. Such a feeble mindset wouldn't do. He'd sworn to get stronger since he'd lost in the final round of the Chunin exams, and now, a year later, this was the first test to truly prove his own mettle to himself. There would be no ifs about it, he would fulfill the mission, period. As he stepped out of the building, he was surprised to see the rest of his team waiting for him. Seemingly having gotten over the less than optimal introduction in the Hokage's office, Rai was grinning widely, and even in the dim lighting, Naruto could make out Mayu's red cheeks. About time, said Rai, pouncing at him. He began to drag Naruto down the street. Come on, I'm starving. There's really no need, Mayu protested, Kakashi following languidly behind her. What are you talking about? I promise you a meal if you pass the Chunin exams, remember? Mayu flushed even more, the very tips of her ears turning red. So? Ramen or tonkatsu? Which will it be? Ramen, said Naruto, raising a hand obediently. Mayu smiled despite herself. Ramen sounds good. Ramen it is, then, said Kakashi cheerfully. Then full steam ahead, Rai crowed, pumping his fist in the air. The next morning, having already packed his essentials, Naruto was out the door as soon as he'd eaten his cereal. The wind felt good on his skin as he made his way to the front gate, and a small smile crept unbidden to his lips. Last night's dinner with his team had done him some good. He felt refreshed and ready. Their client was waiting for them at the gate, and as Naruto took in her appearance, his eyebrows inadvertently rose. Known as the merchant Toru, he'd expected a typically overweight man sporting a ring on each fat finger. In reality, however, she was a thin, freckled woman dressed in baggy journeyman clothes who looked like she could be closer to his age than to Kakashi's. I asked for bodyguards, and I got a bunch of kids? She frowned, her foot tapping impatiently on the ground. We're all qualified Chunin, said Naruto in what he hoped was a reassuring tone. But the merchant's frown deepened. Shouldn't you all be in school or something? Shouldn't you be at your appointment with the plastic menin? Sai returned with a pleasant smile. Mayu let out a squeak of disbelief, but to Naruto's surprise, the merchant smiled toothily back. Not so gutless, then. All right, I'll take you a lot. She kicked the bulky knapsack by her side, which made a thunking sound upon contact. You there with the scar, you can carry this for me. With a scowl, Rai easily shouldered the bag on top of his own. The merchant clapped her hands together. So, are you all ready? I'd like to cover a lot of ground before lunch. Mayu looked around curiously. Are we going by foot? Aren't you a merchant? It's hardly worth paying the fee to ferry a wagon across the sea to Wave Country, and besides, I've got all my goods right here. The merchant gestured towards the bag Rai was now holding. From the sound it had made when she'd kicked it, it was a wooden box, but the contents were a mystery as far as Naruto was concerned. Not that it mattered. Toru was known to be a supplier of an eclectic variety of goods, ranging from precious jewels to dusty tomes, but all his mission required of him was to take her in one piece to Wave Country. Come on then, let's get moving. Taking surprisingly large strides, the merchant began to head toward the opening gates. Hefting his bag higher on his shoulder, Naruto followed, the others right at his heel. Idly seated on top of a tree branch, Kakashi put his book down as he watched from afar Naruto and the rest of his team leaving the village. He'd be leaving too, in about half a day, to follow them. What the Hokage had said about his going on a mission to Earth Country had been a nice bit of misdirection both for Naruto and for Danzo's little spy's sake, but his real mission had been to trail Naruto's team. The Hokage was obviously making a big show out of showing Naruto that he had trust in him and had told Kakashi it was for the sake of observing Naruto's leadership ability. But he knew, and the Hokage knew that the reality was that he could not afford to have their Jinchuriki running around in unknown territory unsupervised. Kakashi had agreed because he'd felt uneasy about leaving Naruto alone with a member of Root, but despite himself, he felt a tweak of guilt at the thought of deceiving his student. All the more reason not to get caught, he supposed. It's been a while since we last went to the hot springs like this, Rai remarked, a note of wistfulness evident in his tone as they peered up at the wooden sign. It had been a week since they had headed out, and although they had made several stops here and there at various cities, they'd made good time with only a few minor scuffles. They had reached the border of Fire Country around noon at the end of the 7th day, and since the boats that ferried people to the Land of Waves only operated in the morning, they had turned in early for the day. As a treat, the merchant, who turned out to be a shrewd, but mostly friendly sort of person, was letting them stay at a traditional type inn, complete with yukata and hot springs. It promised to be an experience not unlike that of Yugakyu from 2 years ago, but this time, hopefully without the crazed renegade ninja. Waving goodbye to Mayu and the merchant, Naruto and the other two boys made their way to the men's section. Stripping down and scrubbing themselves in the bath, they then dipped down in the bubbling water of the hot springs. The only other occupants were a scattered number of elderly men, and a father with his young son in the shallow end. He couldn't completely rule them out as potential assailants, of course, but he didn't think he needed to be on high alert. Judging by the looks of it, the pair in the opposite end couldn't have had more than a handful's amount of teeth between the two of them. But more importantly, their hands, which were resting along the wall, looked unscarred and relatively uncalloused. They were hardly that of a ninja used to a lifetime of handling weapons. His soaked towel resting on his head, Naruto relaxed, feeling some of the tension leave his muscles. Beside him, Rai let out a contented sigh. Remember when we tried to make Kakashi-sensei take his mask off? His arms behind his head, Rai leaned back against the stone wall of the tub. Man, it feels like forever ago. And we never did figure out what he looks like. I've seen it, said Naruto casually. With a splash, Rai's towel fell into the water as he incredulously leaped to his feet. What? How? We were on a mission together, and I walked in on him brushing his teeth one morning, he explained to the other boys' astonishment. So? Rai prodded him. What did he look like? Did he have a huge scar? Was he ugly? Now you're just talking about yourself, Sai interjected with a placid smile. Some of the eagerness fading from his face, Rai shot him a nasty look. I wasn't talking to you, you pasty little. Can you sit down? Your dick's hanging in my face. Turning red, Rai opened his mouth, but Naruto reached up and gave his arm a warning squeeze. After a pause, looking disgruntled, Rai nevertheless sat back down with a splash. After a few more minutes of soaking in the hot water, Naruto excused himself, leaving the two boys glaring daggers at each other, or rather, Rai was, while Sai continued to smile amiably at nothing in particular. Changing into a yukata that the inn had provided, he covered his wet hair in a towel and left to take a cursory look around the inn's grounds. It was then that he noticed someone hunched over in front of the wooden fence that separated the men's bath from the women's bath. It was a large man with shaggy white hair cascading down his back. He was peering through a small crack in between the slats of the fence, and laughing delightedly to himself. What caught Naruto's eye, however, was the large scroll strapped to the man's back. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like a summoning scroll. But before he could decide what to do, the man let out another cackle, and reached into his kimono to pull out an orange book that Naruto immediately recognized as one of Kakashi's favorite reads. As he did so, he noticed Naruto staring at him, and his face immediately turned grave. Holding up a finger to his mouth, he made a slitting motion across his throat in a clear promise of death. The man then returned his undivided attention to the spectacle that lay beyond the fence. After a pause, Naruto walked past. Chapter 19: Heaven-Shaking Event. The attack came under cover of mist. After an early night's rest at the inn, Naruto and the others had risen before the sun, and gotten on board one of the very first boats to Wave Country, a small but sturdy wooden fishing boat, manned by a self-professed freelance poet wearing a woven straw hat. The fog grew steadily thicker as they approached the small island country, and the only sound Naruto could hear was the rhythmic sloshing of the oar as it sliced through the water surface, made opaque by the reflection of the overcast mist. The conversation, which had been scant to begin with, had all but died down in the face of the gray morning. Rai had fallen asleep again, and even as Naruto watched, a trickle of drool silently made its way down the side of his face. It was just as well that Rai had been sitting next to Toru, for just as Naruto reached out to shake the other boy awake, a pair of pale, slimy hands shot out from outside the boat and seized the merchant by the shoulders. A look of shock and then fear flashing in quick succession across her face, she mutely toppled backwards, breaking the surface of the water with a loud splash. While Mayu and Sai jumped to their feet, with a yelp, the boatman ducked behind them. Naruto managed to lean across Rai in time to grab her ankle with his already outstretched hand. Before he could lose his grip or be pulled over himself, he dug his elbow into Rai's chest, and planting his feet against the wall of the boat, he pulled back, feeling the strain in his arms immediately. As Rai choked and wheezed back into consciousness below him, two more dark shadows suddenly burst out of the water from the other side of the boat, and from their hands split off a multitude of smaller shadows that flew straight toward them. Mayu and Sai, with a kunai in each hand, hovered protectively in wait. Rai! Naruto shouted out, as the piercing sound of metal striking metal resounded across the water's surface. His eyes immediately focusing, Rai reached upwards with a grunting sound and wrapped his arms around the merchant's kicking legs. Sticking his head in between, Rai leaned forward, gritting his teeth. Letting go of Toru's legs, Naruto quickly made the necessary combination of signs with his freed hands, noting with some anxiety that with the merchant's head underwater, her struggling had started to weaken. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. In a burst of white cloud, 2 clones appeared by his side, and they both immediately dove into the water. As they did so, Naruto rejoined Rai's efforts and grabbing Toru around the torso, he pulled back. After a few seconds, with his clones keeping the underwater assailant busy, the opposing pull on the other end suddenly gave way, and as they fell backwards, the merchant's head resurfaced with a wet gasp. Her body tumbling back onto the boat, she hunched over on all fours immediately, shaking and coughing out water. Meanwhile, Sai had pulled out a scroll, and with a flourish of his brush, a pair of white and black drawings that Naruto quickly identified as bats had burst out of the page. They disappeared into the fog, in which he could already hear the sound of bluebirds twittering, and shortly afterwards, the storm of shuriken came to a halt. Futon Kyofu, wind release, gale. A strong wind swept into existence, sweeping away the fog surrounding the boat and revealing nothing but a recently disturbed surface. As if in response, Naruto's 2 clones popped their heads above the water, and as he dispelled them and gained their memories, he let out a sigh. They got away, he told the others, though it was mainly for the merchant's benefit. Mayu's bluebirds had already returned and were perched on her shoulders, pecking lightly at her nape. They were ninjas, weren't they? Rai said, his eyes narrowing. What village were they from? They weren't wearing any identifiable markers, said Mayu, as she petted a bird with her finger. With a whisper, they swirled back into hair clips that returned to her hair. Naruto crossed his arms. They were mercenaries, but it's strange. They were a cut above the ones that V attacked us before. He broke off at the sound of strangled coughing. Naruto turned to see Toru on all fours again. Water and bile were dripping from her mouth. Toru-san, are you all right? Asked Mayu, rushing over to the woman's side. I'm fine, said Toru weakly, her face still pale. Naruto noticed that near her collarbone was a sizable hand-shaped bruise that was already growing purple. Naruto turned toward the boatman. How far are we from our destination? I'm fine, I said, Toru insisted, even as she bent over the side of the boat, making a gagging sound. We're not that far from port, the boatman offered helplessly. So long as we aren't attacked again, we should see land in 2 hours. She's a civilian, a head wound like that needs to be looked at immediately, said Mayu, shaking her head. Naruto's gaze shot back to Toru, and he immediately spotted the blood on her scalp. Hesitantly, he opened his mouth. Rai stood up. I can carry her and run the rest of the way. I was the least useful in that fight. Might as well show my worth now. Aha, so you do have some sense of self-awareness, said Sai, with an indulging smile. Your development isn't as regressive as I feared, but still, futile. Your carrying her would jostle her skull and make it even worse. You got a better idea then? Rai demanded, but Sai had already pulled out his scroll once more. Dipping a brush in ink, his hand blurred across the page, and a large black and white bird was soon unfurling its wings before them. Sai clambered onto its back, and Rai and Naruto carefully picked up the merchant, who was now too weak to protest, and laid her behind him. Sai quickly drew something on his scroll, and this time, a long snake burst into existence, which he used like a rope to fasten Toru into position behind him. Please don't get killed on the way back, now, said Sai, as the bird rose into the air. There'd be too much paperwork to do by myself. Just before they reached shore, a black and white fish popped its head out of the water, and when Naruto opened an empty scroll, it turned into black calligraphy that seeped into the page. They're at the house of an acquaintance, Naruto read off the message. There'll be someone waiting for us near the bridge. A bridge? Rai repeated skeptically. What's an itty-bitty little place like that needs a bridge for? It isn't a complete bridge, the boatman said, pausing his rowing to adjust his straw hat. Tazuna is building a bridge to connect Wave Country to Fire Country. That'd put you out of a job, wouldn't it? Said Rai, in a rare moment of astuteness. The boatman shrugged. This is only one of my many jobs. If there was a bridge to connect our country to Fire Country, our economy would improve, and other opportunities would open up. And Gato wouldn't like that, would he? Naruto said. The boatman shook his head. Gato? Like the shipping magnate? Rai said incredulously. Then were the ones who attacked us earlier Gato's men? Mayu asked in a hushed voice. It's not impossible. But why would he specifically target a common merchant with barely anything in her hands? Naruto looked down at Toru's knapsack, which had been left behind. As a B-rank mission, he'd expected some tussles along the way, of course, but that recent attack had been different. It had been planned ahead of time, and the fact that they had been able to attack and slip away so easily showed that they weren't ordinary mercenaries. But as he had voiced aloud, the question was, why would they target their client? Was Toru somehow involved with the bridge? When he realized that no one had answered his question yet, Naruto looked up and saw immediately what had silenced everyone. From the thick fog which had been obstructing much of their view, a gigantic uncompleted bridge had suddenly emerged. It towered above them as their boat quietly slipped between its legs. Coming down from far above, Naruto could hear the distant sounds of hammering and clanging. When Naruto and the others finally stepped on the dock, they immediately spotted Sai, who was seated along the water's edge, drawing something in a small notebook. They waved goodbye to the boatman, who tipped his hat in farewell before rowing away. That took a while, said Sai, closing the notebook shut and climbing to his feet. I was beginning to wonder whether I should be ordering extra coffins. When Mayu's face paled and her mouth opened, he smiled. Just kidding. The merchant is doing fine. She just needs some rest. With that, they began to follow Sai along a dusty but well-trodden path that led away from the bridge. The mist dwindled rapidly as they got further away from the waterside, and soon, they were walking past a rickety rotting sign and into a settlement with rows of wooden buildings alongside a thin river that cut through its middle. The paint on the rooftops looked like they could have been bright once, but had dulled and chipped away, while some buildings were not even graced with a rooftop, and were instead covered with what looked like cotton sails. Most of the buildings were short, as if clinging to the ground, but at their center was one tall building which spiraled out to a watch post at its tip. The streets were busy, but not with the hubbub of an afternoon market. The majority of the people there were walking along dejectedly in their straw hats, looking as if they had nothing else to do. Some wore sandwich signs that advertised their willingness for any type of job, while others dazedly lay sprawled out along the sides of the street with a half-empty bottle in their hands. Mayu stopped at one point, when they passed by a group of small children sitting hunched over against a wall, but was pulled away by Rai. As the others followed Sai inside what looked like a grocery store, Naruto paused as for some odd reason, he felt like he was being watched. Then, his hand whipped out and firmly grabbed the wrist of a bony man whose hand had been straying too close to the bag on his back. Careful, he said, giving the wrist a warning squeeze before letting go. With an answering yelp, the man scampered away and disappeared into the throng of people passing by. For several moments, Naruto waited with narrowed eyes, but the sensation that he was being watched had disappeared. He frowned. Were the people of this village really so poor and broken as to try and rob a, seemingly, defenseless child in bright daylight? He'd visited a large variety of places with Kakashi over the past year, but never somewhere as pitiful as this one. The store's bell clanged as Naruto entered, and he'd barely been able to take in the scarcity of the nearly empty shelves before he realized that his teammates were talking to a bespectacled old man with a towel wrapped around his neck and a girl in an eye-catching red chipao. She looked vaguely familiar with her long pink hair, and she was wearing a leaf 8 like a hairband. Ah, and there's our team leader, said Rai, gesturing toward him. The old man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. I don't think I even saw this many kids in the entire village while I was there, he said exasperatedly, though not unpleasantly. You ninjas sure start out young. Who are you? Asked Naruto, looking curiously at the odd pair. I'm Tazuna, master bridge builder, said the old man, tipping his straw hat with some pride. Naruto nodded, his thoughts turning to the bridge they'd seen as they docked. I'm Sakura. I'm here with Team Shirakumo, said the girl, and Naruto nodded again, remembering that the Hokage had told him about them. Her eyes flitted to the leaf Hitai 8 on their foreheads, and lit up. So you four are all from Konoha too, huh? She scanned their faces, and to Naruto's surprise paused at his. A look of recognition flashed across her face. Oh, I remember you. You were in my class for a bit, weren't you? At the academy? The quiet one? Oh wow, I actually forgot, Naruto, you were transferred to our class late, huh? Said Rai, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Naruto had stopped paying attention to his classmates early on, so he couldn't say he remembered Sakura, but he did vaguely remember having once sparred against a girl with her hair color. However, without responding, Naruto looked straight at Sakura. If you're on an escort mission, why are you still here? Immediately in response, Sakura looked away and bit her lip, while Tazuna coughed uncomfortably. This sort of talk would be better kept behind closed doors, said Tazuna, directing a meaningful look towards the shopkeeper. I'd invite you to my home, but it looks like you already have somewhere to be? The others looked at Sai, who shrugged and pointed at a small stairway near the counter. We're already here. Exchanging a few words with the shopkeeper, a short man who looked nervously around the store's premises, they headed up the stairs, which creaked at every step. Sai knocked 4 times on the door, and after a few seconds, they heard the sound of shuffling. The door opened a crack to reveal an eye, before opening to reveal Toru, whose head was swathed in bandages. Her face seemed to have regained some of its previous color. She stepped back, ushering them in with a quick wave of her hand. Quick, come on in. Nobody's supposed to know I'm here, she trailed off as she finally saw Tazuna standing at the edge of the group. He gaped back at her, his glasses hanging askew. Cain! With a blank look on her face, Toru regarded Tazuna silently before finally heaving a sigh. She opened the door wider in a sign of invitation. You'd better come in then, she said quietly. Inside was a small, clean 3-room apartment not unlike Naruto's own home in Konoha, but judging by the poverty of the rest of the village, it might have been considered luxurious. Toru or Cain disappeared into the kitchen, and with Mayu helping, distributed cups of tea for all of them. With everyone sipping from the hot tea, the story soon came out. My real name is Cain, said the merchant. And as I'm sure you've deduced by now, I am being targeted by Gato for being an accomplice of the bridge's construction. So you were our mysterious benefactor? Tazuna said heavily, looking down at his untouched cup. Why didn't you tell us? What good would that have done? Snapped Cain. Whenever you weren't working on the bridge, you were just a bumbling, drunk fool of an old man. The past year hasn't been kind to you, said Tazuna, not rising to the taunt. At least I'm still alive, she retorted. Which is better than what I can say about my dear brother. There was a pregnant pause. While Sai appeared to be gazing at the design of the teacups with some fascination, Sakura and Mayu stared wide-eyed at the hard-faced merchant woman. Rai uncomfortably gulped down his tea, and Naruto followed suit, taking his first sip of the drink. It was bitter. You are angry with me, said Tazuna at last. For being alive. Cain's head snapped back as if she'd been slapped. Why would I be? You wish I'd been the one executed instead of Kaiza, said Tazuna. This time, it was Cain's turn to be silent. Who's Kaiza? Asked Sakura awkwardly, raising a hand as if she were in class. The hero of this city, Tazuna answered, and at the same time, Cain said, my brother. Cain's mouth thinned into a single line, and Tazuna took off his glasses to wipe it with his sleeve before continuing. He married my daughter, and became my grandson Inari's father. They were like a true father and son, and inseparable, but when Gato took over, he stood up to them. And for that, he was executed in front of everyone. Kaiza was the bravest man I ever knew, and died because of it. My brother wasn't brave, sneered Cain, her hands visibly tightening over her cup. He couldn't protect his first family, so he ran away to Wave Country and thought he'd redeem himself by playing at being a hero, only to get killed, but I suppose compared to you, he was brave. She raised her eyes aggressively toward the older man. He didn't cower behind a fence, watching as an innocent man got murdered. He didn't sit complacently at home, drinking himself silly and venturing out only when someone gave him some coin. He wasn't brave, but he wasn't a coward like you. That's not true, Sakura burst out angrily. Even though it was dangerous, Tazuna-san came all the way to Fire Country. On the way to Wave Country, we even got attacked by a missing nin named Zabuza. Naruto's eyes widened, and from beside him, Rai spit out a mouthful of tea. A missing nin? Mayu repeated, growing pale. Naruto didn't recognize the name, but by principle, all missing nin were dangerous. Any ninja who could leave their village without being caught by their village's hunter nin had to be at least Jonin level. Sakura jumped to her feet, looking upset. Even Shirakumo-sensei got injured during the battle. But after all that, Tazuna-san went right back to the bridge to continue working on it. Another man quit today, but he still isn't giving up. That's all right, Sakura, said Tazuna, though he looked rather touched. What Cain is saying isn't wrong. If you can realize that, then I have nothing else to say to you, said Cain, white-faced. Please leave. At her words, Tazuna's form sagged, making him look even older than he had before. But without protest, he nodded. Leaving his tea still untouched, He reached for his straw hat, which he had hung neatly on a chair. He paused before the door. Thank you for your funding, Cain. If this bridge is completed, the city, no, the entire country will be in debt to you. With a nod to Naruto and the others, he left. Shooting them a final pleading look, Sakura followed him. Several minutes after the door had closed shut, Naruto got to his feet. Keeping his voice neutral, he said, "Well, we have to get going now. I apologize for your injury, but if you want to file any complaints about our work, you'll have to contact our village by post." Mayu and Rai jumped at his words. Slowly shaking her head, Cain reached into her pocket to pull out a handful of coins. "No, your work was satisfactory. This should cover your passage back to Konoha." She averted her gaze. "Thank you for escorting me here. I wouldn't have made it without you kids." Rai hurried to drain the rest of his tea, and the rest rose to their feet. After a few murmured farewells, they left the apartment. "Hey Naruto," said Rai hesitantly, as the store's bell clanged behind them. He looked up at the building with a troubled expression. "Can we really just leave it like this?" Naruto glanced back. "Our mission was to escort her to Wave Country. There was nothing about staying here and helping her clean up her life." "I guess you're right," said Rai, his face clearing up. "It's not like we could do much about it, anyways." They began to walk away, but a few seconds later, Naruto stopped, realizing that Mayu hadn't moved. She was picking at the tail of her hair in the way she did when she was anxious about something, and her eyes seemed fixed on something. Following her gaze, he saw that she was staring straight at a small, hungry-looking girl begging for food on the other side of the street. Naruto suppressed a sigh. Mayu Rai started, but she suddenly put up a hand, silencing him. "You heard what Sakura said," Mayu said quietly. "Their sensei Shirakumo-sensei is injured. That's probably why they're still here. Can we really just go without helping them? They're from Konoha too." "So this isn't about the orphans at all," Rai said sarcastically, crossing his arms. "Or about Tazuna and that mess with Gato." Mayu turned pink. "So what if it is?" "We're ninja, not philanthropists," Rai hissed. Sai drew in a sharp breath, and they all automatically turned toward him. "Did you sense something?" Naruto asked, looking around. The feeling that he was being watched had returned, but there were too many people milling around for him to pinpoint the source. Sai shrugged. "I was just taken aback that he knew such a big word, but you should probably stop talking so loudly about all this. We're drawing attention to ourselves." Before Rai could retort something back, Naruto put a hand on his shoulder. "Sai's right about people watching. Calm down." He turned to Mayu and lowered his voice. "But Rai is right too. We're not philanthropists. Our mission's complete. We don't know anything about the situation besides what we've just heard from two biased sources, and there's little we can do about it. Involving ourselves would mean involving Konoha in a foreign territorial dispute, and the village would lose face with clients." In truth, Naruto couldn't care less about the village's reputation, but he figured playing to Mayu's sense of loyalty would have more effect than the real reason why he wanted to leave. There was the desire to quickly return to Konoha and rack up points for another successfully completed mission, but more than that, this seaside city made him uneasy. It could have been the way he kept feeling like he was being watched, or it could have been the dead look in everyone's eyes, but whatever the source was, Naruto had been itching to leave as soon as he'd set foot in the city. It was a pity about Cain, but Naruto had barely known her for a week, and did not feel the urge to lay down the lives of his teammates in exchange for her continued safety, a safety that, indeed, well exceeded the conditions of their mission. Because the truth of the matter was, his every nerve was screaming at him that it wasn't safe here. Every minute spent here only increased the chances of there being an irreversible danger, and to Naruto's chagrin, he didn't know if he was strong enough yet to protect the team. He knew he had gotten stronger over the past year with his extensive tutelage under Kakashi, but he had yet to win any of their frequent bouts against each other. And if there was one thing he had learned over the past year on their missions together, it was that the world was large and crawling with unknown powerful enemies. There were many weak ninjas, but there were just as many strong ninjas. And without the rules that he'd come to be familiar with in the village and the academy, without the regulations and expectations that, no matter how vaguely, governed the Chunin exam, and without Kakashi acting as an ever-present reassuring shield, Naruto found himself questioning what he was and wasn't capable of, knowing that if he overestimated their abilities, there would be no return trip back to Konoha outside of a coffin, if their enemies were so kind. Is this what the pressure of being a team leader is? He wondered. But Shirakumo-sensei. Shirakumo-sensei is a jonin, Mayu, said Rai, in a slightly calmer voice. Sakura's team should be fine, so long as they don't stick their noses in anything more. Are we going to go or not? Said Sai, managing to look bored even as he smiled. Mayu bowed her head, and with some relief, Naruto turned around. He raised a foot to step forward, and to his surprise she said no. Mayu? Rai asked uncertainly. You heard what she said. Torino, Cain-san is still in danger. What kind of ninja are we, if we abandon her here? She raised her head, and Naruto was stunned to find that her eyes were blazing. I'm going to stay with Cain-san and I'm going to find Sakura's team and see what I can do to help. Mayu, Rai began, but was cut off once more as Mayu held up a hand. She looked piercingly at them. Naruto suddenly realized that her eyes were hazel, not brown, and then when, against all expectations, she smiled, Rai actually took a step back. I'm sorry for being so selfish, she said. But I've never been more grateful that I'm a ninja than I am right now. Without another word, Mayu turned around and disappeared into the store. The bell sounded behind her like a death knell, and Naruto and Rai mutely stared at the closing door with, for once, identically astonished expressions on their faces. Did that just happen? Rai finally let out weakly. Where did that come from? Is that what they call premenstrual syndrome? Sai cocked his head, with what looked like a genuinely curious look fixed on his face. Naruto? Rai turned to him with a pleading look, and for once, he found himself unable to think of what to say. When Sakura opened the door to the ramshackle house beside the windmill and found Mayu beaming back, with Rai, Naruto, and Sai awkwardly hovering behind, she flung it wide open with a look of delight, and the two girls rushed into each other's arms as if they hadn't met for the first time just a few hours ago. I didn't think you'd stay behind, exclaimed Sakura. Of course we'd want to help a fellow leaf ninja in need, Mayu said, clasping her hands together. Isn't that right, guys? Rai scratched his face. Yeah? Totally. No, said Sai. Naruto didn't respond, his mind furiously working to try and salvage the situation. It wasn't new for Mayu to disapprove of one of his decisions, but she had always deferred to them until now. After the initial shock, his immediate thought had been to order her as team leader to return, and if that proved insufficient, to resort to whatever physical means necessary. And perhaps even just a year ago, Naruto may have gone ahead and done just that. But now, as the thought of how Mayu might look at him for it floated into his mind, feeling a tightening in his chest, he dismissed it. Even if it were at the cost of a mission, he didn't know if he could bear either of his teammates looking at him in that way ever again. What's happened to me? Naruto thought frustratedly to himself. Meanwhile, as Sakura uncertainly took in their less than enthusiastic expressions, a male voice called out from another room, Sakura? Who are they? They're Chunin from Konoha, Sakura responded, and a few seconds later, a curious-looking blond boy in a black t-shirt stepped out. He looked them over with a rather suspicious glint in his eyes, which only slightly cleared at the sight of their Leaf 8. How do you know for sure? The boy asked cagily. They could be Gato-esque goons, for all we know. Without pause, he turned around, cupping his hand around his mouth, he said, Hey, Sasuke. Come here for a sec. Do you recognize any of them? Another boy, this time dark-haired, stepped out from the other room, and with an equally wary look in his eyes, he looked at Naruto and his teammates. After a pause, he pointed a finger straight at Naruto. That one. I remember him. Geez, Menma, said Sakura, shaking her pink head exasperatedly. He was in our class for a year. How could you forget? Oh, was he? The boy let out an easy laugh, raising a hand to his neck in embarrassment. My bad. Chapter 20, Foreboding Skies. He plodded down the path, looking with some disbelief at the hand that was pulling him along. It was warm and felt nothing like anything else he'd ever held before, but it was nice, he supposed. What's wrong? The girl stopped to look down at him, but the sun was high in the sky and shone too brightly down on them for him to make out her face. And nothing, he said quietly. Where are we going? The word "we" felt alien to him, and he had to say it twice to confirm to his brain that it was indeed the word he was looking for. You said you've never played hide and seek before, right? She said, tucking a length of hair behind her ear. I found a fun place to play it, and thought you might like it too. Play? He asked shyly. I've never done that before with someone else, I mean. She laughed. You're so weird. Who's never played with someone else before? When he didn't respond, her smile slowly faded from her face. An odd look flashed across her face. Her mouth began to open, and he squeezed his eyes shut, afraid that she'd say something awful and leave him there like everyone else, when suddenly, another voice called out to them. What are you doing? And who's that? He opened his eyes and saw an older boy walking across the street towards them. He had a curious look on his tanned face. This is the boy my mom's taking care of, said the girl, raising a hand in greeting. She gestured back to him with her other hand. Come on, say hello. Hello, he murmured nervously. Hold on, I know him, said the boy, leaning right down to stare at his face. He shrunk back. Yeah, he's the one Kayumo's mom told us to stay away from. Really? Why? I dunno, the boy shrugged, crossing his arms behind his head. She got mad at Kayumo for letting him join our game of tag. Why would she? He's just a kid like us. The girl smiled down at him again. Right, Naruto? Naruto's eyes flew open. Faint motes of light were streaming through the half-open window, and for a long minute, he looked up at the ceiling. A tattered string dangled from the lone light fixture, and as he watched, it swayed in an invisible breeze. Only when his heartbeat had slowed down did he get up. As Naruto got to his feet, the thin blanket he'd been sleeping under fell off, and at the soft sound, the others in the room began to stir. Stretching his arms, he silently walked to the window and pushed it open the rest of the way. They had spent the night at Tazuna's seaside house, and from the window, Naruto could see the waves jostling gently against the dock. And just barely, he could hear the sound of seagulls. The first time he'd visited the sea on one of his missions several months back, he had been taken aback at the high-pitched wailing sound. It sounded nothing like the birds around Konoha, and even more startlingly, it was accompanied by the underlying deep crashing noise of the waves as they pounded down on shore. But he'd quickly come to enjoy it. Despite the cacophony of each separate sound, together, they melded together, and somehow soothed him. Being near the sea was an experience completely alien to Naruto, having grown up in a landlocked village like Konoha, but somehow, it felt familiar to him, as if he were meeting an old friend. As he stood there now, however, it had the opposite effect. The seagulls calling back and forth to each other sounded like a warning. It made him uneasy and restless. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling that tingled almost unbearably across the surface of his skin. We need to get out of here, he thought to himself. Sakura's team leader Shirakumo, a stern-faced jonin with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, had turned out to be recovering from a deep leg wound. However, it was healing well, and the jonin would likely be able to move around freely with just a few more days of rest. With that out of the way, there was no real reason for them to stay behind in this country, and after the night's rest, Naruto's mind felt clearer. His worries about Mayu resenting him for ordering her back to Konoha seemed silly to him now. She was not so unreasonable as to completely ignore the voice of reason. Surely she would listen to him with just a little more prodding? Naruto? Called out a drowsed voice. He turned around to see Rai getting to his feet with half-lidded eyes, audibly cracking his neck. Sai was already up, and was leaning against the wall with his futon neatly folded beside him, while Sasuke was just beginning to put away his. Next to them was Menma, who seemed to have made it halfway out of his futon before falling asleep again, snoozing lightly as a trickle of drool dribbled down across his chin. As Naruto walked back across the wooden floor to fold his own futon, he suddenly wondered about the fleeting dream he had had. But even as he thought about it, like a receding tide, the details slipped further and further back from his memory, and after a while, he stopped thinking about it at all. Tazuna's daughter, a willowy woman with a heart-shaped face named Tsunami, prepared breakfast with Sakura while Naruto and the other boys took their turns in the small washroom. Mayu had gone back to Cain's home for the night. Cain's head wound, while not overtly serious, was still affecting her, and they had agreed it would be better for at least one person to always be with her. The breakfast, while predictably involving fish in almost every dish, was delicious, and it was at the breakfast table, 2 separate tables had to be pushed together to make enough room for all of them, that they met Tazuna's grandson Inari, who turned out to be a gloomy young boy in a dull green jumpsuit. "Isn't he cute?" Tazuna said with a fond look down at the boy, who continued to mechanically spoon fish stew into his mouth. Sitting across the table, Naruto silently paralleled him. "He said we're all going to die," said Menma sourly. Sakura nodded in indignant affirmation beside him. "From what you guys were saying about Zabuza, it doesn't sound too far off," said Rai, as he picked at his plate. He hated fish. "How did you guys escape anyways?" Menma pulled back in his chair with a proud look. "We didn't escape. I almost got him, but some hunter Nin finished him off instead." "You almost got him? It was all Sensei," Sakura scoffed. "And what held Zabuza in place for him?" Menma jabbed a finger at himself, leaving no room for question. "That's right, my mind transfer jutsu." "Oh, is that what it was? I just thought he'd pause to scratch his butt." "Nope, that was me. But scratch and all." It was hard for Naruto to imagine anyone looking as proud as Menma did at that moment. "Are they always like this?" Rai asked Sasuke, who grunted noncommittally into his stew. Suddenly, there was a thumping sound as Inari forcibly put down his utensils. The scattered conversations around the table skidded to a stop, and sliding his chair back, Inari dropped to the floor. Tazuna turned around in his chair. "Where are you going, Inari?" "To look at the ocean from my room." The tsunami wiped her hands on her apron. "What about the rest of your breakfast? You skipped dinner yesterday too." "I'm full." Inari slid the door open and left. Menma and Sakura shared guilty glances while everyone else except Sai, as usual, averted their gazes. "I'm sorry," said Tazuna after a short silence. He took a heavy sip from his cup. "He's been like that since Kaiza died." With the mood in the room having rapidly plummeted, the rest of the breakfast was quiet. To most everyone's relief, soon after breakfast had ended, Mayu and Cain arrived. While Cain and her estranged in-laws began to awkwardly exchange greetings, Naruto discreetly pulled Mayu away from the bemused spectator crowd. Sliding the door shut behind them, Naruto turned around to see Mayu looking a bit pale. She was playing with her hair again, as she always did when she was nervous. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, though her eyes darted to the closed door. "You don't look well. Did something happen?" Naruto critically looked her up and down, but besides the pallor, she seemed fine. "No, I'm fine," Mayu insisted. As if to prove her point, she let go of her hair and crossed her arms across her chest. "What did you want to talk about?" "Mayu, we're going to head back to Konoha today," said Naruto, thinking it'd be best to get straight to the point. Mayu's face fell, but ignoring this, he forged forward. "Sakura's team already dealt with the missing Nin that attacked, and now that Cain is here with Tazuna and the others, Team Shirakumo can protect her too. There's no reason for us to be here." "Cain-san only agreed to come here because you guys were here," Mayu said quietly. "And they can't always be watching over everyone, they've got their hands full with Tazuna-san's family." "What do you plan to do, then? Protect Cain for the rest of her life?" Naruto interrupted her. Taking a step closer to her, his voice dropped in volume. "Or are you going to kill Gato?" To her credit, even as her entire face reddened, Mayu did not take a step back, choosing instead to look firmly back at him. "What's the point of escorting someone to their village, only for them to be killed as soon as we leave them? I don't want to just follow the mission details to AT, collect the money, and go back home. I want to do it properly. And I want to do my duty as team leader properly," said Naruto, letting some of the frustration he felt seep into his voice. "You do realize you're putting us all in danger here?" "We're always in danger," Mayu said hesitantly. "You're right. But you're asking to risk the lives of our teammates just so you can feel better about yourself," said Naruto harshly, and as soon as the words had left his mouth, he regretted them. Mayu flinched backwards and her gaze dropped to the floor. As the seconds silently ticked by, he rapidly searched through his experiences for words to alleviate the situation and found nothing. Finally, he added lamely, "It's not like they don't have money. If Cain-san really wanted better bodyguards, she could have paid for a higher level mission." When Mayu didn't respond, Naruto sighed. That could have gone better, he thought to himself. Not wanting to look at Mayu's bowed head, he looked around the room instead, and almost immediately, his gaze landed on the sliding door. His eyes narrowed. He took a silent step forward and in one quick motion, slid it open. A streak of black flashed out of sight, leaving behind only one lone blonde figure standing awkwardly by the door. Hey, Menma laughed uncomfortably, his eyes rapidly flicking from Mayu's downcast figure to Naruto's blank face. I was just looking for the bathroom. You wouldn't happen to know where it is? Deciding that confrontation wouldn't be worth the time, Naruto pointed a finger in the opposite direction. As he watched the boy scamper away, Naruto considered the streak of black he'd seen. Obviously, someone else had been with Menma, and he was willing to bet his tanto that it had been Rai. But why hadn't he come in and said something? Several seconds passed as Naruto stood still in silent contemplation, and soon, from the other end of the hallway, a pink head popped out. Naruto? Sakura sounded suspicious. What are you doing? Everyone's waiting. Sorry, he said. Looking back at Mayu, he gestured toward her. Come on. Mayu mutely bobbed her head and followed him back to the room where everyone else, except Menma, was gathered. Some of the ice seemed to have been broken, though Cain had made a point of sitting on the opposite side of the room from Tazuna. Naruto caught Rai's gaze, but the other boy only flashed him a grin before returning to his apparently all-consuming task of flattening out the creases of his pants. How are you feeling, Cain-san? Sakura asked, as everyone settled into their cushions. You look better than you did yesterday, but… Cain slightly bowed her head. It was a slight concussion. I just needed some bed rest. I'm fine now, thank you. Quite the luck she's got there, said Sai, a small smile playing on his lips. Although judging by how they attacked, I don't think the assailants were trying to kill her. No, they were only warning me, Cain said in an odd voice. Her eyes hardened as she looked around at the room's occupants, before coming to a rest on Naruto. Now, getting to the matter of business today, Naruto, have you reached a decision as to your team's next action? Naruto paused, quickly looking at each of his teammates in turn. Sitting nearby, Sai looked neutrally back. Farther away, Rai, with an unusually serious look on his face, looked down at the ground, and Mayu, on the opposite end of the room, looked straight at him with a creased brow. Before that, I'd like to hear what Team Shirakumo intends on doing, he said. With that, everyone looked at the Jonin, who was currently resting his splinted leg across two cushions. As Shirakumo opened his mouth to speak, a conflicted expression quickly flitted across his face. 3 days ago, I sent a missive to the Hokage explaining the current situation, and requesting further orders. While I await his reply, we are on standby. Noticing Tazuna's downcast expression, he hastened to add, personally, I feel that it is our duty as ninja to deal with any immediate dangers that risk the safety of our client. However, the ultimate decision is in the hands of our village. That is the best I can offer you. That's already more than enough, Tazuna grunted. What I don't understand is why you need our help, Sasuke suddenly spoke up, surprising Naruto. The Uchiha boy, while not exactly taciturn, had not struck him as the type to take initiative unless the situation absolutely called for it. Cain turned coolly towards him. What do you mean? You clearly have at least some money, as you've been funding the bridge's construction. Why rely on us, instead of properly hiring ninja to deal with the matters here? Or are your pockets not deep enough? Cain opened her mouth, and then closed it. Her hesitation was painfully obvious. However, in gratitude for saving my life, I do owe you all some answers, she said slowly. And even if you cannot help us, I have confidence or hope that you will not turn on us. Cain closed her eyes. The Wave Country's daimyo is in Gato's hands. We cannot raise any form of direct rebellion against Gato, and hiring any ninja above Chunin level would be received as such. At her words, Tazuna's face went taut with surprise. What do you mean in Gato's hands? Is he being kept physically captive? Naruto asked, intrigued against his will. From what we know of our last reports, the daimyo and his immediate family are all being kept in house arrest inside their main residence, Cain confirmed. And you can't just assassinate Gato? Rai piped up, looking confused. Oh, we've tried, said Cain bitterly. But the assassination attempt failed, and Gato killed Lady Awa, the daimyo's wife, in retaliation. The daimyo then made a public renunciation, labeling the actions of any who dared to defy Gato as mutiny. Who is this we are talking about? Sasuke pressed, and then looked meaningfully at Tazuna, who seemed to now be making a passable imitation of a guppy. It can't be the bridge builders. Just a group of the last couple of stragglers with a backbone left in this country, said Cain with a venomous look. Rai scratched his chin. But you haven't tried again since your first failure? Don't you think you gave up too soon? Cain shook her head. You don't understand. Why do you think I was in Konoha? Why do you think I've been traveling around the nations? To sell things? I've been arranging meetings with the Kage of various hidden villages with the aim of making an alliance between theirs and Wave Country. But almost every nation has turned me down, including Fire Country. Really? Sakura looked perplexed. But wouldn't an alliance benefit us? It'd bring more trade into our country. Not necessarily, said Shirakumo gravely, his arms crossed across his chest. Until now, he had remained silent with a neutral expression fixed on his face, but it seemed he had reached some sort of decision. As it stands now, Gato's shipping ventures benefit all of the neighboring countries. There are no tariffs or regulations in place along the coastline, making it an excellent waypoint for maritime trade with farther and wealthier nations such as Water and Tea Country, and Gato is making this possible by taking the money directly out of the citizens' taxes. Yes, Gato knows what he's doing. Cain nodded. He's a parasite, and so long as his actions don't harm the other nations, nobody will lift a finger because ultimately, Wave Country was never powerful or unified to begin with. If Gato were removed from power, there would be an economic vacuum. The few markets that exist would fall into chaos, and none of the other nations want to risk that. The only nation that would pay attention to my proposals was Lightning Country, and their condition was that they be granted complete control over Wave Country's economy. And what did you say in response? Naruto asked. Cain gave him a thin smile. That I did not have the authority to make such a decision. Despite himself, Naruto felt respect for the sharp-tongued woman burgeon inside him. She was clearly doing everything within her power and beyond for the sake of a country that she hadn't even been born to. For a moment, he wondered if it was revenge for her brother that pushed her, but immediately dismissed it. If retribution had been her sole aim, Cain would have arranged for Gato's assassination. Damn all the consequences. Instead, she was clearly thinking for the benefit of the nation rather than her own gratification, even at the risk of her own life. However, no matter how pretty her goals were, in the end, they weren't his business, nor was he interested in making them his. The tsunami was refilling everyone's teacups, and as he politely declined his cup, Naruto looked directly at Mayu. Surely she would understand? They were ninjas. They weren't heroes. At his pointed stare, Mayu turned pink, and she opened her mouth when with a loud bang, the doors slid open to reveal a blonde figure. Menma! Where have you been? Sakura asked in a scolding tone as she got to her feet. Ignoring her, Menma brandished a sealed scroll in his hand. I've got it, the Hokage's response to Shirakumo-sensei's missive. A messenger Jonin found me at the docks. Immediately, Shirakumo raised his hand, and Menma handed it to him. With bated breaths, everyone watched as he unfurled the scroll. For several minutes, it was quiet. Naruto closely observed Shirakumo's face as his eyes rapidly moved across the scroll paper, but as expected of the Jonin, his expression gave nothing away. When Shirakumo finally spoke, however, the note of disbelief in his voice was clear. My team and any other Leaf teams in the vicinity have been ordered by the Hokage to remain in Wave Country and to do whatever is necessary to guarantee the safety of our clients, he said slowly, and Naruto felt his eyes widen. The uneasy buzzing tension was back, sending alarms ringing in his head. Looking up from the scroll, Shirakumo locked eyes with him. The Hokage's seal is on it. So? Cain said softly. What will your team be doing, Naruto? Look, I've really got to make my next delivery, said the Jonin, scowling back at Kakashi. While messenger birds were commonly used within the village walls and on occasion by mobilized teams to send messages back to the village, Jonin specializing as messengers were used to deliver important and direct missives from the Hokage to teams stationed in faraway regions. Kakashi had spotted the messenger slipping away from the house that Naruto and the others were currently in, and feeling in his gut that something was off, immediately pounced on him in the neighboring forest. What was that message you delivered? Kakashi pressed, shoving the Jonin more roughly against the tree. I told you, I don't know. I'm just a messenger. The Jonin protested, putting his hands up. Kakashi noticed that he was young, for a messenger Jonin. He didn't recall seeing him around the village either, but that was becoming more and more common these days, as he spent so much time outside the village walls on extended missions. It was from the Hokage. "That's funny," said Kakashi, with a look that suggested he found it anything but. "I just exchanged messages with him several days ago. You'd think he'd tell me about such a thing." The Jonin shrugged. "Kage's minds work differently from ours. Mere ninja like us can't hope to understand them," he said sagely. "And anyways, the Hokage's seal was on it." Kakashi paused. "Did you receive it directly from the Hokage himself?" "No, I picked it up in water country at the waypoint," said the Jonin, still struggling to free himself. "Look, I'm behind in my deliveries as it is, and I kinda want to get back home by the end of this week." Reaching a decision, Kakashi let him go, and the Jonin straightened. Muttering darkly to himself, the Jonin stretched back his shoulders before leaping nimbly away and disappearing from sight. He didn't like this. Why would the Hokage send a separate message to Naruto and the others, while neglecting to tell him? And why send it all the way to water country first, instead of sending a direct messenger? Sure, there were many more messengers going between water and fire countries, but still either the Hokage was up to something, or... It was extremely unlikely, but even the Hokage's seal could be faked by a powerful Fuinjutsu master. Now, Kakashi found himself with a dilemma. He had to know what that message had said, but at the same time, he couldn't get any closer to the house, or he would be detected. And if it turned out to really be from the Hokage, then he'd have effectively failed his own mission of observing Naruto from afar for nothing. Uncomfortably, Kakashi folded his arms across his chest. He'd give it a day to see what happened. Knowing Naruto, he and the rest of the team would be leaving Wave Country soon and heading back to Konoha. In fact, he was surprised they'd stayed as long as they had. Wanting to avoid running into them on their way back, Kakashi had stayed along the borders of the country until nightfall and then found, to his surprise, that they had decided to spend the night. However, Naruto was the practical type, and Kakashi fully expected the boy to try and go back to Konoha as soon as possible. But of course now, the Hokage's missive changed things, and Kakashi felt himself growing worried. He wondered if it was just his nerves as team leader, and being unable to actually do anything. Regardless, if Naruto and the others didn't start going back home soon, or if they started acting strangely on the way back if things came to it, he'd make a new decision then. Kakashi supposed that if he found himself cornered, he could find a way to get Shirakumo alone and have a talk with the other Jonin. But for now, as promised, he would keep watching. It was only after the Inzokami threatened to have a restraining order placed on him that, with great reluctance, Jeriah the legendary Sannin, the great Toad Sage, and best-selling author of the hugely popular Ika series removed himself from its premises. It wasn't that he was afraid of the local police, not by a long shot, but if his dashing mug were to be plastered on posters all around the nation's bathhouses, his research would sadly come to a screeching halt, and then what would he say to his adoring fans? Hitting the road again, Jeriah tactfully thought to make himself scarce from that area, for a few months, and mulling over his well-worn map, decided to head north to Snow Country. He'd heard that the women there had the most beautiful pearly white skin, and that the hot springs there were medicinal, and indeed, Jeriah thought that he deserved some time spent healing, with the heartache he now nursed at the thought of his self-imposed banishment from his own country. Instead of heading directly by a land route, which would lead him on a cumbersome path straight through the borders of several nations, Jeriah decided to board a ship, as a sea route would both be faster, and make for a nice change in pace. In fact, for the next installment of Ika, he had been thinking of having his main character engage in a whirlwind romance at sea with the beautiful maiden daughter of a ship's captain, which would of course have to end tragically so that he could write a sequel. The journey was cut short, however, as it seemed that, despite the thick fog surrounding the land of waves, most ships stopped at its main port city to refuel, as well as to load and unload goods. Hearing from the captain, who, to Jeriah's great disappointment, had never married nor fathered any daughters, that the ship would be docked for several hours, he went ashore with the intention of stretching his land legs. And for the first time in many years, he found himself speechless with shock. Jeriah had been walking past a row of disheveled buildings near the port center, when he saw what looked like a small child crawling on the ground. His lower body was covered by a black rubber tarp, and it was only after Jeriah gave the boy a second glance that he realized that the boy didn't have any legs. The child's face was bony and drawn, and the only signs of life were his hands, which relentlessly slapped down on the ground before him and pushed his body up just a few inches at a time. "Where are you going, child?" Jeriah asked softly, kneeling beside him. However, the boy didn't seem to hear him. Instead, silently, he kept pushing himself forward. If he makes it to the other side of the city by tonight, he'll get fed, said a young girl, who'd been poking lethargically at the ground with a stick. Jeriah paused. Fed? By who? People who think it's funny, said the girl with a shrug. Something hard clenched in Jeriah's stomach, and he got up. He looked around, and as if seeing for the first time, finally noticed the hard gazes of the passing people and the listless children gathered at every corner. Jeriah had heard the rumors, of course, about how a man named Gato had managed to get his claws on a small island nation and suck the very life out of its people. At the time, he merely thought that it wasn't any of his business and had passed it over. But hearing was not the same as seeing, and the mild discomfort he had felt then now turned into full-blown sorrow. It had been a long time since he had seen people brought down to such low levels. It had been bad in Konoha for a while following the Nine Tails attack, but nowhere near what he saw here. No, the last time Jeriah had seen such a bleak setting had been during the Second Shinobi World War, when orphans on war-torn battlefields had been like particles of sand on a beach. When he returned to the dock, his mind was a storm of roiling thoughts, but one made itself the clear winner. We're leaving in 10 minutes, you'd better return to your cabin, said the captain, leaning over the railing of the ship. Jeriah rummaged in his pocket, and finding a coin, he flipped it up to the man, who caught it with an adept grab. I'll be staying here for just a bit longer, he called up to him. You can keep the change. Waving his hand, letting the captain's farewell wash over him, hold on, hey, come back here. This isn't the full fare. Jeriah began to head for the nearest bar, where he would hopefully be able to pry from the loose lips of a drunken sailor the full story of the country's current sorry state of affairs. The sun was low in the sky when they reached the dock. The fog for once was gone, leaving behind a gradient of purple to orange that then dissolved into murky water. There were only 2 boats there. One was a battered-looking fishing boat that had likely seen much better days. The other was a cargo ship, with black steam belching obnoxiously from a smokestack. It was on this ship that they'd be getting on. Before boarding, Naruto and the others exchanged farewells with their benefactor. I appreciated your escorting me here, Cain said with a gracious smile, dabbing at something in her eyes with her sleeve. I'll never forget you all, and I hope you won't forget me either. Oh, we will, Sai promised pleasantly. Mayu smiled tremulously. Goodbye, Cain-san. You have to be brave, Mayu, said Rai, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. I know. Well, let's get going then, said Naruto a tad impatiently. With a final wave, Naruto and the others boarded the ship, which they found themselves fortunate to have caught. It would have been tough to find one leaving Wave Country on such short notice, but with Cain backing them, money had exchanged hands and the ship's captain had agreed to make a short detour back to Fire Country. You kids a ninja? The captain, a gruff-looking man with a thick black mustache, eyed their 8 suspiciously. Awfully young, aren't you? Actually, our growth got stunted by our training. We're probably around your age, assuming you're 60 or so. The captain couldn't have been a day over 50, but with his usual placid smile, Sai displayed his remarkable aptitude for lying through his teeth. Naruto privately thought to himself that the boy could probably do quite well for himself in the Chunin betting games. We appreciate you going out of your way to take us back to our country, said Mayu earnestly. Leaning over the side of his ship, the captain spat out a wad of something black and slimy into the ocean, giving Naruto an unwelcome inkling of what the murk in the water could be. Before that, though, we'll be making a pit stop at a port town farther up north. That'll be just fine, said Naruto. Now, if you'll excuse us, we'll be resting in our cabin. We're tired and we have our own food, so unless the ship catches on fire or something, you don't have to bother with us, Rai added helpfully. Your own food, eh? Well, I'm not complaining, said the captain. Then with a grunt of dismissal, he turned around to shout something at a passing crew member. Naruto and the rest of his team slipped into their cabin, where for about an hour they rested on rotting bunk beds that creaked with every slosh of a wave against the ship's hull. When they felt the ship still and footsteps increased in volume around them, they each removed their 8 and pulled on a nondescript cloak. Making sure that their faces were hidden below the hoods, they crept out onto the boat's deck one by one, being careful to mingle with the small crowd of people who were getting off the ship. It had grown dark and damp, and their cloaked figures did not stand out from the others, who were similarly dressed. Just as Naruto stepped foot on the gangplank, however. "Hey, you lot!" A crew member hollered down at them, and they froze, wondering if they'd been caught. "Yes?" Mayu asked, shuffling around. The man, or rather, boy, looked down at them imperiously through beady eyes, and in that split second, Naruto began to reach for the kunai strapped to his thigh. But then, the boy's expression caved in, and leaning forward, he lowered his voice. "It's my turn to peel the potatoes, so I can't go on land, but get me something I can chew on for a bit. I'm feeling queasy. Here, I'll even give you a coin for it." He flipped something toward them that glinted under the dim dock lights as it spun, and with a practiced hand, Rai grabbed it smoothly out of the air. "Of course," Rai answered, looking down at the coin, and then back up at the boy with a predator-like smile. "I owe you," said the boy gratefully with a queasy smile. However, as soon as the boy had disappeared from sight, Rai pocketed the coin with a whistle. "Rai!" Mayu hissed. "What?" Rai said defensively. He had to learn his lesson sooner or later. As they exchanged small talk, the four casually separated from the rest of the group, and once Mayu had indicated that the coast was clear, they slipped down the wall to the river that spanned the town. The darkness of the night and the shadows of the overhanging bridges and walls hid them. Directing their chakra to their feet, they began to run across the water's surface as silently as they could. Only when they had left behind the last building of the port city did Naruto allow himself to even slightly relax. "Do you think that was good enough?" Rai muttered. Naruto glanced around, straining to extend his senses as far as he could. They were now in marshland, and with the moon almost completely blocked out by clouds that evening, even their trained eyes found it hard to make out anything in the horizon. "The most obvious presences are gone now, but to be sure, I'll keep the clones around for as long as I can," he said quietly. It had been Cain's idea. While they hadn't exactly announced themselves to Wave Country, Naruto and his team hadn't bothered to hide their presence or their identities. That was the point of their aid after all, to identify them as ninjas of their villages. Anyone who dared to trifle with someone wearing the leaf Hitai 8 would be responded to in kind by the full might of Konoha, and Konoha was one of the most powerful hidden villages. However, Cain had suggested that Naruto and his team should pretend to leave Wave Country, so that her and Tazuna's enemies would relax their guard and underestimate them. Shirakumo had liked the plan, agreeing that 8-leaf nin gathered in one place was too obvious of a confrontation and would likely provoke unwanted attention. Giving Shirakumo his due respect as the most senior ninja in the vicinity, Naruto had bowed to his suggestion. His shadow clones, disguised as each member of his team, were still in the ship's cabin while he and his real team were to return under cover of darkness to Tazuna's town. They would have to lie low for a while, of course, but the gnawing sense that he was being constantly watched had disappeared, and Naruto suspected their plan had gone off without a hitch. As Naruto continued to run in the deep darkness, his thoughts turned to the clones he'd left behind on the ship. He told the others mostly for size sake that he would dismiss them as soon as the ship reached Fire Country, but it had been partially a lie. Everything about the Hokage's missive had seemed fishy to him, and it hadn't been the fish stew. Why had the messenger given the message to Menma, instead of Shirakumo, for whom it had been intended? Normally, messengers were under strict orders to deliver their message to a specific recipient, and depending on the importance of the message, had to go through several stringent procedures to verify the recipient's identity. And even if the message really had been from the Hokage, why were they being told to stay in Wave Country, effectively interfering with the affairs of another nation? At least another dozen questions raged inside his mind, but Naruto suppressed them. One of his clones had left the ship with them at the pit stop, and would make his way back to Konoha. Once there, he'd be able to get a direct explanation from the Hokage about what was going on. Until then, he would obey the Hokage's mandate. And while he didn't like it, he would go along with Cain's fantasies of freedom and Mayu's illusions of playing hero. At the moment, Naruto couldn't see his teammates, but he could sense them running beside him, and he felt something hard clench in his stomach. It was dangerous out here in Wave Country, and he'd do whatever it took to protect his team. Whatever it took. But suddenly his eyes widened and Naruto came to a screeching stop, as with zero warning, almost as if slamming headfirst into an invisible wall, he felt a horrifyingly familiar aura of cold blood lust surge up out of seemingly nowhere. A cry of alarm rising belatedly to his lips, he immediately fell into a defensive stance. Hearing Rai swear beside him, he felt the others do the same. Well, what do we have here? A gloating man's voice rang out from the darkness several meters in front of them. New heathens to offer up for divine judgment, that's what. Shut up and do your job, newbie. Stop calling me a newbie. Chapter 21, Earth-Shaking Matter. You must be Nine Tails. What do you want? Came the rumbling reply. Lend me your chakra, said Naruto. Otherwise, we'll both die. The claws that had been futilely swiping at Naruto from between the bars froze in midair, and then without any warning, the being behind the gates burst into a deep and rasping laugh that, as it resounded across the brackish water, raised the hairs on the back of his neck. True, if you get killed here, that'd be inconvenient for me. You've got guts, if anything. Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far. Man, I'm sick and tired of this stupid patrol duty, said the man, making a spitting sound. Naruto felt his eyes narrow. The roiling bloodlust he was exuding was even stronger than Naruto could remember it being just 2 years ago in Yugakure. It could have felt that way due to the sheer vastness and emptiness of their surroundings, but nevertheless, if it had been a single storm cloud before, it was now a tempest. You think I want to be here wasting my time? Replied another man's gravelly voice. Who are you? Name your purpose. Naruto heard Mayu speak up bravely beside him, and he realized she must not have recognized the man. We're not supposed to let ninja in this area, said the man he had identified as Haiden, ignoring the first part of her question. So we're going to kill you. Or actually, Kakuzu, how about you stay out of this and let me have some fun? Naruto slowly began to reach for the tanto strapped to his back, thankful for the darkness. It seemed that Haiden had not recognized them either, but what could he mean by not supposed to? And who was the other ninja Haiden had called him Kakuzu with him? From the sounds of their voices, I doubt any of them would even fetch a price at the bounty office, grunted Kakuzu, sounding wholly dissatisfied. Rai let out a nervous laugh. Whoa, ease up, man. Let's not be too hasty. Don't you know who we are? Ha! The boss told us to rendezvous with you guys here, Rai continued, his voice remarkably smooth. Well, he did mean you guys, right? This seemed to give Haiden actual pause. For a split second, as if a dog had just caught the scent of something other than its prey, the thick bloodlust wavered. And in that same instant, Naruto formed the clone seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. Accompanied by the sounds of exploding smoke, 10 physical copies of Naruto solidified into existence, each one bearing a ready tanto in hand. Go, he said, and his clones burst forward in the direction where he sensed Haiden and Kakuzu. In response, as they practiced, he heard the high-pitched warbling of blue birds as they freed themselves from Mayu's hair, and the telltale rustling of paper as Sai drew out his scrolls. 4 o'clock, Rai! Mayu cried out, and from Rai's direction came the sound of hissing, and then the whistling sound of deadly metal flying through air, followed up by a string of explosions. Slightly averting his eyes from the brief orange glows of the blasts, Naruto saw on the floor ink-black snakes wriggling straight into the resultant smoke. In theory, it was a simple tactic. Using his clones to first surround and herd the enemy, Mayu would use her blue birds to confuse them, and in the case where they didn't have any visual information on their targets, to gain intel on their whereabouts. Rai would follow up with exploding tags to further confuse them, and in the resultant disorder, Sai would bind them with his ink snakes. Then in theory Naruto and Rai could go in and finish off whoever was left. He blinked, processing the newly gained memory of one of his clones who had just been destroyed. In the fleeting glimpse the clone had gotten from the light of the exploding tags, either Haiden nor the other man seemed particularly perturbed by the commotion they had just set off. However, Naruto had never expected it to. Now, Naruto said. As the others disappeared using the shunshin, he dashed toward the cloud of smoke with his tanto raised in his hand. In the passing split seconds as he approached its center, his remaining clones began to leap out of the smoke, their tanto at the ready. Naruto's brow furrowed as he urged a current of lightning chakra now almost a second nature to him as his wind chakra had been to run through his body, and then simultaneously, he and his clones thrust their tanto into the boggy ground below. Blue and pure white sparks lit up the watery surface. As with a crackling sound, the earth broke into pieces, consuming anything still remaining on its surface. Naruto's clones exploded in sequential clouds of smoke, but Naruto himself had long since flashed away. The night clouds had momentarily drawn back, allowing through a few stray rays of moonlight to light his way. Touching back down and running as fast as he could in the direction they'd been headed, Naruto soon caught up to the rest of his team. With chakra powering their feet, they were running in spearhead formation with Mayu at its head. "How much of a lead do we have?" Rai hissed, as Naruto quietly drew beside him. Naruto drew another tanto from his back. "Not much," he said shortly. "The moon's back out, and it'll be hard to lose them in open space. Where are we headed?" "My birds tell me there's a forest about 3 kilometers ahead of here," said Mayu, casting an anxious eye back. Lifting his head, Naruto looked straight forward, but even with some of his vision restored, most of the horizon was still a haze of dark outlines and blackness. "But why are they even chasing us?" "I'm not sure," Naruto admitted. Hayden hadn't seemed to have recognized them even after their exchange, so it couldn't be some twisted form of vengeance. And it didn't seem to be out of malicious boredom either. He and his partner had some sort of ulterior motive in mind. "Maybe they've given up," said Rai in a hopeful tone. But even before he'd finished talking, all 4 of them stiffened as a voice howled from behind them. "And where the hell do you think you're going?" They fell silent, straining their ears as if they would be able to hear the approaching footsteps of their pursuers. The wind was blowing in their faces, and Naruto thought grimly of how it must be carrying their scents back. "We'll be killed if we only run like this," said Sai matter-of-factly, sounding as serious as Naruto had ever heard him. "And killed if we fight them head-on," Rai muttered. "We need another diversion, a better one. Until we can reach the forest." "I can try staving them off with my birds," said Mayu. "No," said Rai immediately in a brusque voice. "They'd break you as soon as they were upon you. Mayu, that's the guy who took on Kakashi-sensei back in Yugakure and survived, and this time, he's got a buddy with him." Mayu's control over her blue birds worked best when she was physically near them. While they could instantaneously process information over a distance of up to 5 kilometers, actually channeling her through them was only possible when she was within a radius of 100 feet of them. The others had all turned to Naruto for his orders. As his thoughts raced over their options, he felt his pulse rate begin to pick up. If they continued to simply flee toward the forest, Hayden and Kakuzu would catch up before then. But at the same time, Naruto couldn't ask any one of them to stay behind in order to distract the two to make time for the others that would essentially be condemning them to death. But what other choices were left to him then? Should they try fighting head-on with Hayden and his partner, despite not knowing the extent of their combative abilities? Naruto glanced at Mayu and Rai's pale but determined faces, and felt his throat go dry. "Well, Naruto?" Rai prompted him. "This is what we're going to do," he said at last. The Wet Dog was one of the better-known taverns along the pier, with the best sake found anywhere along the coastline, or so the drunk sailor that Jeriah had interrogated claimed, anyways. And so, he found himself sitting down behind the countertop, swirling warm sake around in a cup while keeping an eye out in the crowd for anyone who looked like they could be by themselves. Soon enough, with a scraping sound, a flushed-looking man dressed in the telltale, and rather threadbare, cotton coat of a fisherman settled into the wooden chair beside him. Flagging the barman down with a finger, the man let out a loud hiccup. His unfocused eyes traveled across the bottles and flasks of sake behind the counter, before moving on to his neighbors. When Jeriah felt the drunk man's eyes on him, he looked down at his cup, before taking a sip from it. "You a foreigner?" The fisherman slurred, leaning his face haphazardly against his hand. Where from?" "Fire hit country, by the looks of it." Jeriah made a non-committal sound, and put his cup down on the countertop. "How about you?" "Born and raised in Wave," the fisherman hiccuped. "You fish for a living?" Among other things, the barman had brought him a small plate of fried seaweed and octopus, and he began to chew at it, making an audible crunching sound even over the din of the tavern. "Other things?" Jeriah repeated. "Crunch. Can't survive here no more doing just one thing." "Is the economy not doing well?" "Yeah, this place has gone to the dog's crunch market, might as well be non-existent, lucky to get 100 Rio for an entire shipment of fish, even." Jeriah let out a whistle. "For an entire shipment? Sounds rough." "Tell me about it," The fisherman let out a grunt, bobbing his head. If I had anywhere else to go, I certainly wouldn't still be here. Jeriah traced the rim of his cup with a finger. Still, you sound like you're doing rather well for yourself. Well, I pay my dues, yeah? That's the secret to survival around here, if you know what I mean. As drunk as he was, the fisherman had lowered his voice with a furtive look around, but the barman was serving another customer at the other end of the counter. Huh, said Jeriah, injecting as much admiration as he could into the single syllable. The thing is, everyone knows the daimyo ain't in control no more, yeah? It's the gangs who run the place now. It's all about staying on their good side. The fisherman broke off to noisily pop another octopus leg into his mouth, and as Jeriah waited for him to continue, he watched as it was crushed into bits between the man's yellow teeth. You don't get in their way, crunch, and you give them what they want, and they'll leave you alone long enough to scrape enough Rio together to buy a night's stay in bed and some sake for your belly. The man broke into a raucous laugh, and patted his stomach. Jeriah followed with a rumbling laugh, holding his sake cup to the other man's face. You seem like a sensible sort of man, say, you wouldn't happen to know, would you? If I wished to invite some fair company into my bed without fearing for my neck around here. The fisherman immediately placed a knowing hand on Jeriah's shoulder, having recognized the brother in need. You need speak no further, my good man. You'll be glad to know that with just one word, you'll be guaranteed a restful night anywhere around here. Oh? And what's that? The man grinned, his teeth gleaming in the sickly light. Akatsuki? Immediately, Jeriah had to stop himself from reacting to the name, giving the fisherman only a small nod of acknowledgement. With forcibly stilled hands, he raised the sake cup to his mouth, draining the rest of it. Akatsuki. The criminal organization that Jeriah had devoted so many years of his life to researching, the organization that Orochimaru had joined after defecting from Konoha, could they truly be operating here? In Wave Country? Whatever the case, one thing was certain: his decision to stay behind in Wave Country had been the right thing to do. Something big involving Akatsuki was about to go down, and there was a good chance it had everything to do with the current fiasco with Gato. Jeriah hadn't been sure what he would do after discerning the cause behind the country's ruination. There was a limit to even what he could do, but now that he knew the Akatsuki had a hand in this place, he knew he had to do something, even if that something only involved further intelligence gathering. That was what he had been doing all these years, after all, even going so far as to let down the Third's hopes of him taking up the mantle of Hokage. But as much as it had been his determination to retrieve Orochimaru, it had also been for his home, Konoha. Because no matter how many years it had been since he'd actually been there, when it came down to it, Jeriah would never let down Konoha, even at the cost of his life. Hey, are you sure about this, Naruto? Mayu asked uneasily, as she took off her cloak. You do know that if they don't fall for it, we'll be sitting ducks. I know. Naruto took off his cloak, and immediately, he felt goosebumps rising on his arms as the harsh wind bit into them. To be fair, that hidden guy doesn't seem to be the brightest bulb in the box, said Rai, his own cloak already tucked under his arm. His partner gave me some bad vibes though. What was his name again? Kakuzu? Kakuzu, Sai answered, and the others turned to him. He's an S-rank missing nin from Taki. How do you know that? Rai asked, looking rather taken aback. He's been listed in the bingo book for quite some time now. Rai opened his mouth to question him further, as it were mostly Jonin and Anbu who held bingo books, but Naruto held up a hand. Enough. Later. Focus on the mission at hand now. Are you all ready? He looked at each of his teammates in turn, and with focus refilling their expressions, they nodded. With a nod back, he brought his hands together in the clone seal Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. With puffs of identical clouds of smoke, a dozen Narutos fell into place on the ground beside them, matching their punishing pace. Naruto, the real one, flung his cloak at the pair nearest him, and one immediately tugged the hood over himself. At the same time, Mayu and the others also threw their cloaks at a pair of clones, until there were 4 clones wearing each of their cloaks. With every cloak clone paired with one without, all 12 of his clones shot off into slightly different directions but headed ultimately for the forest. See you too soon, Rai muttered before turning sharply on his heel and heading east, away from the forest. Sai, with a reluctant glance back at Naruto, quickly followed suit. Stay safe, Mayu whispered back, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. Naruto heard her step into place beside him as they ran in the opposite direction, west. The forest was large, even though they weren't headed directly for it. The black mass of trees grew rapidly bigger and bigger as they closed the distance. Without their cloaks, the chilly night wind struck harshly into their faces as they raced along the marsh, the cold bog water seeping into their sandals. Naruto looked back, but there appeared to be nothing there beside the long stretch of marshland they had just crossed. The bloodlust too had faded, leaving behind just the beating of his heart in his chest, and the shallow breathing of Mayu running next to him. "Have your birds found them?" he asked Mayu, who brought her hands together to make the bird seal. "They can't get near without being detected, but it looks like Haiden is headed straight for the forest," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "And Kakuzu?" "None of them see him." "All right. Keep the bird on Haiden, but make sure it's not detected, and keep the other birds searching for Kakuzu. Have Rai and Sai reached the end of the forest yet?" "They've just reached the other end," Mayu confirmed. "They'll be out of range soon." "Good, keep your birds with them for as long as you." Naruto broke off and his eyes widened. Without even enough time to shout, he raised up his tanto to protect himself. With a grunt, Naruto had just barely managed to raise it in time before a powerful kick slammed into the flat side of his blade, sending him flying backward. Still struggling to hold his tanto in front of him, Naruto dug the heels of his sandals into the ground and felt the wet earth wedging alongside his soles from the sheer force behind the kick. Finally, he came to a stop, his legs covered with cold slabs of mud. "What happened?" he heard Mayu gasp. The dark figure that had attacked him out of seemingly nowhere hadn't followed him, choosing instead to cross his arms and regard Naruto with an almost leisurely interest. "You're quite fast on your feet," said a deep voice. It was the one who had been with Haiden, the one named Kakuzu. It was still too dark to make out his features. All Naruto could make out in the dim light was a dark, bulky outline. "How did you find us so quickly?" Naruto asked, his heart pounding in his ears. "I commend you for thinking of using the wind in your favor as quickly as you did. I'll admit, I was fooled at first, thinking the four of you had split and headed separately for the forest. In fact, I'm pretty sure my idiot of a partner is even now still headed for the forest. But unfortunately for you two, I'm not him." With that, Kakuzu suddenly shot forward, heading straight toward them, but this time, Naruto was ready. He held his hand out before him, urging his chakra together. Rapidly, streams of blue light began to encircle his palm, swirling faster and faster until it had formed a tight ball. Digging his heels into the earth, Naruto sent lightning chakra into his feet, igniting his nerves, and with an explosive sound, he too kicked off, raising his hand into the air to meet Kakuzu. "So you're a ninja, big guy?" The girl he had fondly nicknamed Grapefruit Breast slapped lightly at his knee, rubbing her namesake against his arms. She was dressed in a Chinese-style qipao dress that was slit dangerously high up along her thigh. "Gwahahaha. I'm not just a ninja," Jeriah let out a loud laugh, his face flushed red with sake. "I'm one of the legendary Sannin. They call me Jeriah the Great Toad Sage." "Wow, a Sannin," gushed the identically dressed blonde girl on his other side, who he'd tenderly nicknamed Bubble Butt. She paused, tapping a manicured nail against her plump lips. "What's that again, Fukumi?" "Gosh, Fukuyu, don't you know? It's like you know, that communist guy." "Stalin?" said Bubble Butt dubiously. Jeriah had no idea what they were talking about. "Women," he thought affectionately. Following the advice of the fisherman he'd met at the Wet Dog, Jeriah had soon managed to find himself in the shadowy region of the harbor city, where he'd been welcomed with open arms into the private room of a slightly more trashed bar. Guzzling down fried squid and vats of sake with a beautiful woman on each arm, Jeriah was having a hard time remembering what he'd been so serious about just hours ago. "So what are you here in Wave Country for?" Grapefruit Breast had returned her attention to Jeriah, and was now lazily stroking his chest with her long nails. "What else but to meet you ladies?" Jeriah said as smoothly as possible, an effect that was slightly ruined by his missing his mouth with his cup, spilling some sake on his shoulder instead. "Oh, you're so silly," Bubble Butt giggled. "Let me guess, you're on some super top secret ninja mission, aren't you?" "I can't say," Jeriah said regretfully, closing his eyes in sorrow. "If I did tell you, I'd have to kill you. And if you two ladies were gone from this world, what meaning would be left to living?" The two women burst into high-pitched giggling, clutching at his arms. You can tell us. None of us will remember in the morning, anyways, Grapefruit Breast said in a sing-song voice, this time rubbing her breasts along the nape of Jeriah's neck. Not after what we plan on doing with you, anyways, Bubble but breathed into his ear, her breath coming out hotly against his skin. At her words, Jeriah's eyes widened and he fell into a fit of coughing. When he'd finally regained his breath, he wheezed, so where were we? But first, what's the magic word? Grapefruit Breast jumped up on his back playfully, and wrapped her arms around his neck. The magic word? He blinked. Bubble but wrapped her arms around his arm possessively. You know the word you have to say to get anywhere here. Waha! Oh, that one, he said, thinking back to the fisherman with bad teeth. Grapefruit Breast's cold fingers caressed his face. Yes, that one. Akatsuki, wasn't it? Jeriah said lightly. Wrong, Bubble but hissed. Jeriah's eyes widened, but before he could do anything, Grapefruit Breast's weak grip on his head immediately turned iron strong and she twisted her hands, snapping his neck. At the same time, with a flash of gleaming steel, Bubble Butt's hand slashed across the front of his exposed neck. Warm blood spurted out, dotting her expressionless face with red. The two women let go of the Sannin and backed away. With a thud, the body dropped to the floor of the room. The white hair fanning around it added a sense of finality to their deed. See? Said the blonde, looking down at the body with a slight sneer on her face. There was nothing to be nervous about. Her partner poked the body with the heel of her pumps. Zabuza-sama said he'd be strong, though. Give a ninja a woman and some sake and he's only a man, the blonde said sagely. I guess so. Are you sure he was a Sannin? That would be as not was, said a voice from behind them. Stiffening in shock, the blonde let out a cry of alarm, but before she could do anything else, something long and white had wrapped itself around both of the girls' bodies, immobilizing them. Squirming fruitlessly to free themselves, they saw before them the ninja they had just killed regarding them with a grave look on his face. But how? Cried out the blonde. She looked down at the ground just in time to see the dead Sannin and the puddle of blood explode into a cloud of smoke, leaving nothing behind. Her heart pounding painfully against her ample chest, she slowly raised her eyes to meet the other ninjas, and what she saw there made her tremble. Now, ladies, said Jeriah. Where were we? Missing Kakuzu by what felt like the width of a hair, Naruto's Rasengan slammed into the earth, sending out a great wave of mud. Before Naruto could move out of the way, his face crumpled in pain as he felt a crushing force slam into his ribs, sending him flying backwards. Then even before he'd landed, Kakuzu was right in front of him again, moving as fast as he could. Naruto ducked low below his leg, and kicked out sideways in a leg sweep, but dodging that, Kakuzu jumped high into the air. Grimacing in pain, Naruto propelled himself after him with another crackle of lightning chakra, flashing into the air just above Kakuzu. With his teeth gritted, he concentrated on the ball of blue chakra materializing in his hand, determined to take advantage of his aerial position. The moonlight was just behind him, and in that instant Naruto could finally make out what Kakuzu looked like. Dressed in a large black cloak that was fluttering in the wind, the man's face was mostly covered, but Naruto could see a pair of green pupil-less eyes staring straight back at him. They widened, as Naruto's hand plunged straight for the man's heart. But in a smooth motion that seemed almost impossibly fast, Kakuzu's arm struck out at Naruto's hand, driving it outward so that it missed him, and with another turning kick that connected on his shoulder, sent him crashing down into the ground. With another grimace, Naruto managed to twist on his hands to lessen the impact, which still sent out even more waves of mud in every direction, separating him from Kakuzu. As they waited for the mud to settle, Naruto hastened to clamber to his feet. Seeing tiny stars circling around him, he swayed and then almost jumped, as suddenly, a raucous sound was that squawking? Filled the air. Naruto! He heard Mayu call out urgently. He turned and saw not only Kakuzu bearing down on him, but further back, what looked like a dense, dark cloud descending upon them. Immediately understanding her intention, he struggled to gather himself together, and then flashed away, dodging just in time Kakuzu's leg. Landing a safe distance away, Naruto saw the flock of shrieking birds set instead on Kakuzu, screeching and nipping at the ninja. Impatiently, the man batted at the bird, ripping it in two, but instantly, the parts recombined back into a whole bird once more. This time, Kakuzu kicked out widely, destroying almost half the flock, but again, the birds reformed, and continued to peck at him. Lowering his leg, Kakuzu made a tsking sound of impatience. Seemingly deciding to ignore the birds for now, he instead returned his gaze back to Naruto. I didn't realize, Kakuzu growled, sounding as if he were talking to himself. Whereas he had only regarded Naruto with passing interest before, his concentration was now wholly on him. For some reason, his eyes seemed especially fixated on Naruto's hair. What is your purpose for attacking us here? Naruto called out, with a pant. Kakuzu took a step toward him, and his eyes narrowing, Naruto lowered himself into a defensive stance before continuing. You're an intelligent one, aren't you? Said Kakuzu, not sounding even the slightest bit winded. At least, more so than the last Jinchuriki we captured. Naruto froze. As if an eraser had wiped across the chalkboard of his mind, everything went blank. From a distance, he heard Mayu speak up, her voice tight with anxiety. Captured? What do you mean? Kakuzu opened his mouth as if to answer, and then suddenly, he stumbled. A look of fleeting surprise flashed across his face. What's this? Kakuzu held a hand up to his head, as if holding himself steady. A shadow of a bird's wing flashed across his face, and as he looked around at the birds, understanding filled his expression. Ah, the birds. My birds have poison on their beaks, Mayu said shakily. And once a sufficient amount reaches your heart, it'll stiffen the heart muscle until it becomes so hard, it completely stops pumping blood, rendering it useless. I see, said Kakuzu. His hand dropped to his side. He looked at Mayu, his strange eyes glinting. How fortunate for me, then, that I have multiple. Before Mayu could react, Kakuzu exploded forward. He ignored Naruto, and as if in slow motion, Naruto blankly watched Kakuzu go straight past him. His eyes trailed from the moving ninja to, just ahead, the target, a pale, shaking form with widened eyes. Where have I seen this before? The nostalgia of the scene, as if clubbing Naruto in the head, brought him back into his senses. Mayu! Naruto cried out. With a painful crackle, lightning chakra swept through his entire body, and he flung himself forward. Moving faster than he could ever remember moving before, Naruto got in front of Mayu, but before he could do anything else, Kakuzu's kick connected with his chest, making a terrible crushing sound. The force behind it was powerful enough to send the two of them flying into the air before careening into the muddy ground. With the wind knocked right out of him, and his ribs screaming at him, he was fairly certain they were at the very least fractured. If not broken, it was all Naruto could manage to land on his 2 feet. To his relief, he heard Mayu land on her feet as well. With Naruto having taken most of the impact, it seemed that she was unharmed. He felt something warm trickle down his chin, and when he raised a hand to wipe it off, it came away red. Calmly, Kakuzu lowered his leg and looked straight at him. Panting, and with his teeth gritted, Naruto regarded the ninja. The way Kakuzu seemed to always be one step ahead of him, and the way Naruto's attacks seemed to be a mere hindrance, rather than an actual threat, it was almost like fighting Kakashi. But in this case, a Kakashi who did not care at all for his well-being. One thing was for sure, Kakuzu was too strong for him. Naruto wiped away another trickle of blood from his mouth. What should I do? Clearly, fighting Kakuzu one-on-one the way he was now would only get both him and Mayu killed. Even fighting 2-on-1 was also out of the question. Mayu was a long-range support ninja, and one of her most offensive weapons, the flock of blue birds, seemed to have no real effect on Kakuzu. Their escape strategy had failed them, and their attempts at reasoning or bargaining with the man had gone nowhere. Worst of all, Kakuzu had talked about Jinchuriki as if he'd fought with one personally before and as if he knew about what Naruto was. However, that didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that Naruto was going to be dead very soon if he couldn't figure out how to take on Kakuzu. But how? Kakuzu was stronger and faster than him. Naruto couldn't keep using his lightning chakra forever to dodge him, and he'd yet to even show his hand at. Kakuzu was completely out of his league, so how could Naruto defeat him? What did he have that Kakuzu didn't have? What Kakashi didn't have? Naruto felt a cold bead of sweat drip down his temple. He recalled in his mind the words of a year ago, the words of a monster: "You've got guts, if anything." Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far. His hands balled into fists by his side. He told himself that he was merely putting off talking to the beast because he was so busy, but the truth was he never wanted to use its power. But now what other choice did he have left? Letting out a deep breath, Naruto forced himself to relax. Closing his eyes and clearing his mind of everything else, he prepared to set foot once more in the long watery corridors of... What? He heard Kakuzu suddenly speak, and his eyes flew back open. Kakuzu had been silently regarding him, occasionally batting aside the birds that still continued to peck at him, but now, his head was tilted upward, as if talking to someone in the sky. After another long silence, Kakuzu bowed his head. Very well, then, as you wish. Kakuzu lowered his eyes to meet Naruto's shocked ones. I'll be back eventually. Prepare yourself. And then without another word, he disappeared. Chapter 22 Veritable Pandemonium. The ship's departure from the dock had been stalled for some time for an unknown reason, but finally, when both the sky and the ocean had become a deep inky black, it set off again. The lights from the cabins cast a reflective yellow glow across the sea, making it an easy mark for Kakashi to follow. Keeping watch from below the stern of the ship, it hadn't taken him much effort to identify the cabin Naruto and the others were in. Naruto must have passed by an uncovered porthole, for Kakashi had immediately noticed the flash of red. It's not like you to let down your guard, Naruto, even if you're returning from a completed mission, Kakashi chided silently. As the hours passed, the wind picked up and the lights in the cabins began to flicker off. Kakashi himself was starting to feel it in his shoulders. I'm getting old, aren't I? He thought amusedly to himself, and he'd been drenched in icy sea water more than once from straying too close to the ship. Finally, only when Kakashi had narrowly avoided being vomited on by some poor straggler at the deck of the ship, did he decide that it was time to actually get on board. Projecting a burst of chakra down to his legs, Kakashi shot himself up along the ship's side, landing silently in the shadowy silhouettes of a stack of wooden barrels. Looking around the empty deck, he made sure that the coast was clear. Though even if it weren't, he doubted he'd come across any real trouble. The ship had some hired guards, but they were at best genin-level ninja who could barely tell apart clones from the real thing. No, the hardest part about this would be hiding his presence from Naruto and the others. However, Naruto's cabin was all the way at the other side of the ship, and it was unlikely that any of them would venture out before dawn, by which time they'd already be at the border of Fire Country. The best course of action, he decided, would be for him to simply sit tight where he was, and then get off the ship before it docked at port. Suddenly, hearing footsteps, Kakashi shrunk further into the shadows, but it was just a stumbling, pale-faced cabin boy simultaneously swearing and hacking up what looked like the rest of his dinner over the railing. Nevertheless, Kakashi kept his eyes sharp and watched the boy, with the final utterance of a curse word, stumble back down through a hatchway. Kakashi wrinkled his nose. Some of the vomit must have splashed onto the deck, for he could quite clearly smell, along with the distinct odor of stomach acid, that dinner must have involved quite a few potatoes. What are you going to do to us? Grapefruit Breasts breathed in a high voice, her eyes flicking down repeatedly to the object he was twirling in his hand. Surely you don't think we'll crack from you tickling us with a feather, Bubble Butt scoffed. She'd recovered face relatively quickly despite being completely immobilized in his hair trap, but the underlying tension was still apparent. This will make excellent material for the next book I'm writing, said Jeriah with a shake of the feather. It'll take some time, but you ladies aren't particularly pressed for it, I hope? We're not telling you anything. Bubble Butt spat at Jeriah, but he made no move to avoid or clean it off. He sighed instead. For her own sake, he hoped she would. They were waiting where they had agreed to meet, by a massive oak tree near the edges of a forest along the far outreaches of Tazuna's village. After everything they had already gone through, Naruto had braced himself for the worst, so when Rai and Sai's faces finally came into view, the relief he felt was so immense, he nearly stumbled on his landing. With Mayu helping to support him, the two of them landed down just as the sun was starting to rise, spreading its tendrils almost shyly through the cracks of the canopy trees. Mayu! Naruto! Rai called out to them, relief spreading across his face. Leaving Sai behind, he began to run toward them. Your woe, Naruto? Rai hesitantly came to a stop in front of them, his eyes raking up and down Naruto's bloody form. I'm fine, they're just flesh wounds, said Naruto, deciding not to mention the pain in his ribs. The pain had already ebbed away to a minor throbbing in his chest. Sitting down, he tipped his head back and allowed himself to lean back against the tree trunk. Kakuzu found us, Mayu said shakily, her arms crisscrossing across her chest. Rai's eyes widened. You too? What do you mean? Naruto frowned, quickly turning toward the other boy. Were you caught too? Yeah, that other one hidden, he got to us, Rai confirmed with a troubled look on his face. Then, apparently noticing Mayu's expression, he hastened to add, but nothing happened. He was just spewing a lot of crap and then he suddenly started talking to the air, before leaving. That's essentially what happened with us, said Mayu. Except Kakuzu didn't talk so much. Rai's face noticeably grew in pallor, and this time, it was her turn to add, don't worry, I'm alright. It was Naruto who fended him off right until he suddenly left. As some of the color returned to his face, Rai let out a whistle. Didn't Sai say he was an S rank? And you managed to hold him off? Naruto didn't say anything, but clenched his hands tightly. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet his teammates' eyes. It had been his plan to split up the team and send off Deku's, but it hadn't worked. His decisions had placed all of his teammates in danger, and it could only be called a miracle that they were all there alive. Naruto, he heard Mayu start, but she was cut off as suddenly. Rai punched him on the shoulder so strongly, he could have sworn he'd heard another rib crack. Naruto's head snapped up to see Rai looking down at him exasperatedly. Oh, come on now, enough with the gloom, said Rai. 2 insanely powerful lunatics were after us, but the 3, well, for I suppose of us are all here in one piece, relatively unharmed. What more could you ask for? Naruto paused. Sorry, he finally said, his hands uncurling at his sides. Rai was right, this was no time to be wallowing in regret. And if it was any consolation, despite Kakuzu's comment about Jinchuriki, Mayu seemed to be none the wiser. Anyways, Rai said, waving away his apology with a dismissive air. We did get something out of that hidden guy. Turns out they weren't just a random pair of criminals walking around in the middle of nowhere. They're involved with whatever's going down in Wave Country right now. Mayu's hand leapt up to her open mouth. You mean with Gato? There's going to be an event of some sort in 3 days, Sai finally spoke up. It seemed the incident with Haiden had gotten to him. He seemed unusually on edge. Someone important will be in the city. Rai shrugged. Well, that's the basic digest of what we thought Haiden was saying anyways. It's probably got nothing to do with us, but... Naruto got to his feet. But first things first, we need to get back. We'll decide what to do after we've gotten back in touch with Shirakumo and the others. However, forced to take multiple detours and roundabouts to throw off any possible trackers, it was several more hours before Naruto and the others finally reached Tazuna's home. Ushered through the door by a worried-looking Tsunami, the starving 4 were promptly seated at the table with platters stacked high with, as one could have guessed it, fish and rice. Once they had managed to get out the full story of what had happened, the involved adults stood around with troubled expressions on their faces while Naruto and his teammates stuffed their faces. An event in the harbor city in which someone important will be in danger? The Tsunami murmured uneasily. There's only one thing that could be, said Cain flatly. Tazuna sighed. The ceremony. The ceremony? What's that? Menma cocked his head curiously. You've got a piece of rice stuck on your face, by the way, he pointed out to Rai, who ignored him. The daimyo and his children will be paraded through the city in a charade of well-being, with the stated purpose of reassuring the citizens that they are doing just fine, Cain spat. But basically, one of Gato's ways of appeasing the other nations by telling them that he's not trying to overthrow the system. And at the same time, reminding everyone in the country who's really in control, Shirakumo murmured, his brow furrowed in thought. So is the daimyo going to be assassinated then? Tazuna asked in a heavy voice. It depends on whether those 2 you described, Haiden and Kakuzu, was it? Work for Gato or not, Cain said. But regardless, this doesn't change anything. Risks like this have already been accounted for in my plans. Naruto put his chopsticks down and looked at Cain. Plans? The others had also stopped eating, though Rai continued to chew on some seaweed as they waited for the gorilla merchant to answer. She looked around at them seriously, her freckles in stark contrast with the morning lighting. I've already forced you all to overextend your stay for the affairs of a country that have nothing to do with you, she said, with a slight bow of her head. And I am truly sorry for that. But that ceremony in 3 days is when all my plans come to a head. After that ceremony is over, whether the mission has succeeded or failed, I will ensure with all my power that you are all properly compensated and relieved from your obligations here. And this mission will involve? Shirakumo crossed his arms across his chest. Cain smiled grimly and looked directly at Naruto. How good are you all at behaving like actual, normal children? Hiromo whistled as he looked around at the messy scene. This is brutal, Jeriah-sama, his nose wrinkled. Is that something burning I smell? Hiromo was one of his trusted sources in Wave Country, and their mutually beneficial relationship had a long history spanning the many years Jeriah had spent building up his spy network. The short ponytailed ninja's best characteristic was, in Jeriah's opinion, the way he showed up promptly and without any unnecessary questions as soon as he was called for. He was, if anything, efficient and experienced in covering his tracks, making the chance of his being caught and spilling details of their alliance rather minuscule indeed. Jeriah sighed heavily. If only they'd break sooner. He made no move to wipe his face, which was speckled with tiny flecks of dark blood. It would have been better for them. I assume you got the information you wanted? Some. The one who actually knew anything didn't break quite so easily. Squatting down, Hiromo opened the mouth of one of the bodies, peering inside it with the air of looking at an interesting museum specimen. You had preventative measures to stop her from biting her tongue or ingesting any sort of poison, I gather? Yes, Jeriah said simply. He chose not to mention how he'd chosen to end her life as soon as he realized that he'd gotten everything he'd ever get out of her. A loyal one, she'd been. She was working for Zabuza, who is in turn working for Gato. Hiromo nodded in confirmation. Yes, I've heard multiple reports about Zabuza being spotted as a bodyguard for Gato. He's not exactly a difficult man to miss. But is that it? She didn't seem to understand the significance behind a certain word they were using as a code name for suspicious individuals such as myself, but perhaps you could shed some light on their connection to them. This certain word being? Hiromo said curiously. Akatsuki. Akatsuki, Hiromo repeated slowly, tasting the word with his tongue. His eyes had lit up like a child that had just caught sight of a favorite toy he had put aside at one point, and then forgotten about its existence. I'd heard rumors but dismissed them. Rumors about? Jeriah prodded him. About a growing organization that was supporting Gato from the shadows or even controlling, perhaps, Hiromo said. Then with a thoughtful look, he added, there's been a confirmed recent sighting of Kakuzu at one of the bounty stations along the coastline. Jeriah folded his arms across his chest, processing the information. Kakuzu was one of the more frequently spotted members of Akatsuki, showing up from time to time to turn in a ridiculous amount of bounties in exchange for money. However, there was nothing Jeriah could do about that. Bounty stations were strictly black market, and while information regarding Kakuzu's visits could be bought at a price, his visits were indiscriminate and without pattern, making them impossible to track. Hiromo got up, wiping his hands clean on the sides of his pants. Was that it, Jeriah-sama? There was one final thing I got out of the interrogation, Jeriah said distractedly. They were supposed to report back to Zabuza at some sort of big event soon, in the harbor city. Do you know anything about that? That'll be the daimyo's ceremony for sure, said Hiromo without any hesitation. Ceremony? Out of the way, kid! In the fat man's hurry to get to the front of the crowd, he reached out with an impatient hand to shove the small boy to the side, but to his surprise, it swiped uselessly through the air. The man glanced down and then did a double take, finding nothing there. He looked around, but there were at least a dozen other children of the same size and coloring in the immediate vicinity. The boy could have been any one of them. So, with little more than a fleeting wondering thought, the man moved on. Meanwhile, through bright blue eyes, Naruto watched the man disappear into the crowd before effortlessly merging into it once more. As he began to be jostled forward by the mass, he looked around at the numbers calculatingly. It seemed that a substantial number of people had gathered at the city for the ceremony, for he had never seen even half that number of people during the busiest hours of the city. And while most of them looked like civilians, there were some who stood out like a sore thumb, namely those with weapons. Most were subtle, with daggers strapped to their thighs, but here and there were the obvious ones with bulky swords and katana on their backs. Those kinds of people walked about with a bubble around them, as the civilians avoided eye contact and gave them a wide berth. A flashing motion caught Naruto's eye, and he turned to see a scruffy-looking boy with dark coloring nod at him before ducking and disappearing into the crowd. As he looked around, several more caught his eye: a sour-faced girl with short hair, a scratched-up boy with cropped black hair, Sakura. Menma. He couldn't spot Mayu, Sai, or Sasuke, but that was because they were situated on the other side of the venue, a winding path that led from the daimyo's ceremonial estate to the city center. They were all arranged strategically near the front of the crowd, along with most of the other civilian children. It was a custom in Wave Country for the daimyo's procession to hand out ryo and candy to the watching children, and as Naruto looked around at the many orphans crowding around him, it was apparent that most of them had made the pilgrimage here for that very purpose. Is this why Cain-san took it as well as she did, when she found out we were her escorts? Naruto wondered. Henge, the transformation, was an E rank, but it was difficult to maintain perfectly while under high external strain. And the closer your transformation was to your real appearance, the easier it was to maintain it. For example, it would be easier for an adult male to transform into another adult male than into a young boy, and vice versa. Once Naruto and Sasuke's teams had transformed into typical hungry-eyed children, melting into the background became effortless. This was key for the mission Cain had proposed to them 3 days earlier in Tazuna's house, to rescue the daimyo's 2 children, the prince and princess, so that Gato couldn't use them as a means of controlling the daimyo anymore. According to Cain, rescuing the daimyo himself would be too risky. Not only would he be the most heavily guarded, but it would only give Gato a reason to seize the vacuum of authority left behind in the daimyo's absence, no matter how temporary. Suddenly, there was a flurry of motion and then hushed whispering. The moving crowd came to a stop, all of the heads facing one direction, and there, at the far end of the pathway, Naruto could see what looked like the beginnings of a procession making its way through. At the back was a series of ornately decorated sedan chairs, from which Naruto could make out smiling faces and waving hands, the daimyo and his children. And standing around them was an array of women and men with kunai and swords glinting nakedly on their persons. Naruto quickly did a headcount and saw that Cain's information had been on spot. The sedan chair holding the princess and prince was relatively lightly guarded with 3 bodyguards, not including the carriers. If Cain's information could be further counted on, there were a few more guards scattered in the crowd disguised as civilians, but if their plan worked out, they shouldn't have time to matter. The daimyo's sedan chair, on the other hand, was surrounded by no less than 7 guards, most prominently of which was a pale-skinned man with bandages running across the lower half of his face, and a gigantic broadsword on his back. Without fail, wherever he passed through the crowd, a visible wave of fear swept through it. "That's Zabuza," a passing voice hissed tightly in his ear. Menma and Naruto nodded. So this was the infamous missing Nin. He thought that Menma's team had finished him off, but this was no time to question things. Either Zabuza had survived or someone was impersonating him. Whatever the case, he was another powerful obstacle they would have to get through to complete the mission. Naruto felt an uneasy shiver go down his spine. It was strange, however, that a missing Nin could be so boldly parading in front of thousands of people like that. No matter how powerful he was basically painting a target on himself for any of his village's hunter Nin. As he waited for the signal, Naruto watched the procession get closer and closer to where he was standing. Every now and then, a hand, full of something that glinted brightly in the afternoon sun, popped out of one of the sedan chairs, and every time, as if a dam had broken, the children surged forward. There seemed to be some invisible rule in place that prevented adults from joining in. When a few stragglers moved forward to do so, they were promptly knocked out by the children around them. If they were lucky, their unconscious bodies were dragged out to the edge of the crowd. Just as the first sedan chair began to pass by where Naruto was waiting, the hand popped out once more, and this time, he could see that it was attached to a young-looking girl dressed richly in pale robes. She looked cheerful, likely she was too young to understand the precarious hostage situation her family and country was in. The children around Naruto surged forward, and he joined in half-heartedly. He reached up in the air with a hand and in that instant met the princess' gaze. Her eyes were blue, like his. Taken aback, he held his breath, and then with a bright smile, she tossed the coins in her hand toward him. Before they reached him, however, several of the larger and rougher orphans knocked his hand aside and leaped up to swipe the coins. Naruto saw another orphan boy aiming a kick at his chest. Easily dodging it, he nevertheless pretended to have been hurt and fell backward in the crowd, intending to disappear and lose whatever small attention he'd unintentionally gathered. But before Naruto hit the ground, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him up. He looked up to see a tall man with long shaggy white hair, and immediately recognized him as the man he chanced upon in the bathhouse a week ago. "Are you all right?" said the man, and Naruto mutely nodded, his mind whirring with several possibilities. Was this other man working for Gato? Had he found out about the plot, and seen through Naruto's disguise? But before Naruto could do anything else, the man simply said, "Be more careful from now on," and then walked away. Naruto stood still, unsure of how to react, and as if answering him, a roaring sound filled his ears. Naruto's head snapped toward the procession's path just in time to see 3 massive black and white tigers leaping at Zabuza the signal. The crowd had been stunned into silence, but as the missing Nin pulled his sword off his back with an accompanying flash of steel, they were galvanized into action. Screaming, people, children and adults alike, began scrambling away from the path. The same orphan boy who had tried to kick Naruto before came running at him with a panicked expression on his face. Leaping forward, Naruto jumped past him, heading straight for the procession. Naruto landed on the path, with Rai, Sakura and Menma right behind him. All of the guards were distracted, focusing their attention on the other side of the path, where now, on top of size beast drawings, a flock of birds as well as several fast-moving bodies were wreaking havoc. Naruto pulled the tanto from his back and in the same smooth action, burst forward to the princess and prince's sedan chair. The main guard, a tall disciplined-looking woman with hair tightly pulled back in a bun, noticed him, and as she raised her blade toward him, her mouth opened to shout a warning. But before she could make a sound, Naruto passed her with a spray of bright red blood. The body fell to the ground and her head rolled away on the ground. When Naruto glanced behind to check, he saw that Rai had similarly taken care of the other guard, while Menma and Sakura knocked out the third. Menma and Sakura looked at them with stunned expressions on their faces, but paying no mind, Naruto reached into the sedan chair. The prince and princess, looking terrified, had backed away to the other side. Noticing that their eyes were fixated on the blood dripping from his tanto, Naruto hastily returned it to its sheath. Then, he grabbed the arm of the princess. Rai grabbed the prince and pulled her trembling figure out. She began to struggle in his hands, but she was weak, even for a civilian. "What are you doing?" the princess cried out. "Stop." "We're here to save you," said Naruto quietly. He shot a look toward the daimyo's sedan. Though Zabuza's back was toward them, one of the guards had noticed them and had started to move toward them with a sword in his hand. "We don't have time. Come quietly, or I'll knock you out." Growing still, the princess' eyes became as round as the coins she'd been tossing out, and taking advantage of it, Naruto tossed her over his shoulder and jumped out of the chair. Just as he prepared to leap down into the crowd, there was a scream. "Rai!" Naruto turned to see Rai duck just in time to dodge a long sword. Rai backed away protectively in front of the prince, as the guard thrust the sword again at him. Naruto's hand immediately went down to the kunai on his thigh holster, but before he could throw it, there was a flash of blue and then the guard was yelping, swiping at the air around his face with his hands. "Mayu!" Rai yelled out, relieved. "I'm okay. Go help the others." Mayu, pale-faced, nodded. Menma tackled the guard she'd been distracting, and she ran off, her birds flocking around above her head. To Naruto's relief, Zabuza seemed to be completely ignoring them, focusing his attention instead on the Jonin weaving in and out to attack him. Shirikumo. Naruto and Rai jumped down into the crowd, the princess and prince collectively in their arms, and began to run swiftly past the shocked faces of the civilians. As they ran through the mayhem, one guard managed to get past Menma and Sakura, but Naruto quickly disposed of him with a flick of a kunai. After that, with a cursory look around, Naruto confirmed that there was no one else coming after them. "Send the signal," Naruto said shortly. Rai nodded, and brought his hands together in the snake hand seal. Immediately, there was a distant exploding sound. On the other side of the gigantic crowd, a billowing black cloud of smoke rose into the air, a planted harmless letter bomb that signaled that Naruto and Rai had successfully retrieved the prince and princess, and that the others should retreat. "Be safe, everyone," Naruto thought to himself, his teeth gritted and his heart pounding loudly in his ears. With a long history of battle with fate, Jeriah had set foot in the harbor city that morning, steeling himself for whatever the day's events should throw at him. However, what was unfolding before his eyes had even his mouth dropping wide open. It was utter chaos. Any semblance of order had dissipated as soon as the missing Nin from Mist drew his sword. Civilians were screaming and scrambling to distance themselves, while a scattered few in the crowd were drawing hidden blades and struggling to reach the procession. From what Jeriah had been able to see, it looked as though a group of ninja had attacked the guards standing around the daimyo's sedan chair. While the guards were distracted, a group of 4 civilian children swooped onto the sedan chair in front. It was at this point that Jeriah realized they probably weren't as innocent as they looked, and pulled out a pair of children, before running off with them. Jeriah was now in a quandary. Should he interfere? And if so, which side? The supposed kidnappers, or those who had been keeping the daimyo hostage? His gut was tugging him in the direction of the daimyo's sedan chair. As a cloud of black smoke suddenly burst beside him, the level of screaming around him elevated to even higher heights. But Jeriah could tell it was harmless. He decided to trust it. It was, after all, what had kept him alive all these years. Leaping strongly into the air, Jeriah headed directly for the daimyo's sedan chair, and as he did so, immediately, he could tell that something was off. The smoke must have been a signal for them to retreat, for the various ninja that had been attacking were now trying to flee. But even as he watched, the one named Zabuza knocked out a black-haired boy with a swing of his blade and then reached out to grab a thin woman, who slumped in his grasp. There were 2 cloaked figures beside him, one holding an older man and a struggling young girl in each hand, the other exchanging blows with what appeared to be a shinobi wearing the leaf hitayate. Now that Jeriah was close enough to see, he knew immediately who he was facing. The masked one was Kakuzu. The other one was not a familiar face to Jeriah, but judging from his black cloak, was a member of Akatsuki as well. Jeriah-sama. The shinobi, who Jeriah suddenly recognized as one of the Leaf's Chunin, cried out. Is that really you? Leaning forward, Jeriah thrust out his hand and struck a pose. Yes, it is me. Jeriah, the great toad sage and best-selling author of Ika. Zabuza turned toward him. So you're one of the legendary Sannin, Jeriah. He released the woman he'd been holding. Falling to the ground, she scampered away. The man beside Kakuzu looked interested. A Sannin? As much as I'd like to get the bounty on your head, Sannin, said Kakuzu, I have no interest in fighting you today. Some other time, perhaps. He jerked his head at the other man, who scowled widely. Zabuza stepped back to the sedan chair to grab a frightened-looking man in fancy robes. Some other time, you say, said Jeriah? That'll be difficult, seeing as how you'll be dead. Chapter 23, Raising the Curtain. For what felt like the 100th time that day, a distant explosion rocked the ground. The walls of the building shook, and dust from the ceiling trickled down around them. There was a dull clamor in the distance that could have been the sounds of screaming, but she tried not to think of it. Princess Awano of the Land of Waves did not understand what was happening to them. Just that morning, she had finally been allowed to see her old nursemaid, and she had been dressed in fine silk robes that felt unbearably soft after months of wearing nothing but rough smocks. The small man in black glasses had been there. He'd appeared in her doorway with the 2 bodyguards who never left his side. And then he promised her that if she or her little brother ever stopped smiling on that day's procession, he would rip off all of their fingernails. Awano believed him. The last time the small man had made them a promise, her mother had disappeared. And she tried her best. Every time Haki looked like he was about to cry, she squeezed his hand and stretched her own smile even wider. But even though she never stopped smiling, their guards had all been killed in front of them, heads and bodies falling unnaturally away from each other. Amidst explosions and shouting, they'd been dragged from their chairs and carried away. Now, they were hiding in an empty building by the waterside. Haki shook in her arms, and Awano drew him in closer to her thudding chest, but she dared not scream. After all, the 2 who had kidnapped and brought them here were right in front of them. The one with a scar on his face silently paced back and forth, gripping what looked like a knife in each hand. In sharp contrast, the other, with bright red hair, the one who had taken Awano, was pressed up against the wall by the door, stock still. They had been hiding in the masses of children that had swarmed her sedan chair, but they must have been working for the man in black glasses. And now, they were just waiting for the signal to kill. Awano looked down at her brother, and smiled at him. Maybe she just hadn't been smiling enough. Maybe if she kept smiling, she thought, the small man in black glasses would change his mind. Suddenly, the boy who had been pacing stopped, and at the same time, Awano thought her heart would burst. Someone's coming. As far as Naruto was aware, everything had gone pretty much according to plan except for the final and most important part, that everyone regroup at the safe house Cain had managed to procure. Well, he and Rai were there with the prince and princess, but the absence of the others who should have been back by now was painfully apparent. If the plan hadn't stressed the importance of sticking to their individual parts, Naruto would have already left by now in search of his remaining teammates. As it was, he had to force himself still, and lacking the means of any meaningful communication, the most he could do was to keep his senses sharp for the slightest sound of approach. Thankfully, he wasn't kept waiting for too long. The first to arrive was Cain. She came alone, shivering from either cold or adrenaline. As soon as the door opened, the merchant woman froze and stared at Naruto. She looked lost, as though she hadn't been the one to outline the entire plan in the first place, before a look of relief filled her face. Stepping into the building, however, some of the relief began to visibly fade. "Where is everyone else?" Naruto cleared his throat. "You're the first one to make it back. And hopefully," he added to himself, "she wouldn't be the last." "You didn't see the others? Did you see Mayu?" Rai prompted, his tone worried. Cain shook her head. "It's chaos out there. We all got separated. I barely got away by myself. I'll get into the details once the others get here." His jaw setting, Rai didn't respond. Instead, with an extra crease lining his furrowed brow, he resumed his pacing. Meanwhile, Naruto returned to his position by the doorway, his head spinning with possibilities. It had always been a risk of the plan that some of them wouldn't make it back to the safe house. In fact, it was a risk that had always been there from the start. It was an integral part of their job description. Naruto was well aware, and had assumed the responsibility that came with it as soon as he'd accepted the mission. And yet, there was something very wrong with their current situation. Something had felt off from the moment his team had arrived in Wave Country. Had it been mere coincidence that he had met Haiden again? That Haiden had been with someone who knew about Jinchuriki? And who in the world was that white-haired man he'd met at the bathhouse and again at the procession? It was as though he held several puzzle pieces in his hand, with no idea of where the rest of the puzzle was, or whether they all even belonged to the same puzzle. A frustrating thought, understanding how little he knew, yet lacking the capability to learn more. It was then, with his thoughts being thrown about like leaves in the wind, that Naruto caught sight of the princess' face, and it gave him pause. Was it because Cain was an adult, unlike he and Rai? With every step Cain took towards the two children, Naruto thought he could see the color drain from the princess' face. The princess' mouth opened, and he thought she would speak. Suddenly, his attention snapped up towards the ceiling. There was an open crack there that led to the outside, and something had just slipped inside a bird. For an instant, hope welled up in his chest, but it was quashed just as quickly. It was a small bird made of ink, not a bluebird, and it flew down straight into his hands. "It's from Sai," Naruto announced, reading the contents off a scroll. "He and two others are on their way." As if right on cue, the door slammed open, and Sakura and Menma staggered inside. Looking slightly less bedraggled, Sai followed them. As the three collected their breaths, there was a pregnant pause. And then, "Where's Mayu?" Rai blurted out. "I'm fine, thanks," said Sai, but for once, the smile was gone from his face. He looked around at the building's occupants, and his gaze fixed on Cain. Something there hardened. Before anyone else could say anything, Sai made his move. And somehow, Naruto knew what he was going to do. In a flash of movement, there was a screeching sound as Sai's kunai met Naruto's, an inch from Cain's exposed neck. "Some other time you say that'll be difficult, seeing as how you'll be dead." Even before the last few words had left his lips, Jeriah began to move, joining his hands together in the snake seal, Renjishigami no Jutsu, Wild Lion's main technique. His chakra coursing through his hair, it burst out into what looked like gigantic white ropes that surged through the air, flying straight towards his opponents. In an impressive range of diversity, the men immediately splintered into three different responses. With the two bodies still in his hold, Kakuzu deftly leaped into the air, evading his attack. Zabuza, on the other hand, released the man he had been holding and stood his ground, countering his technique with an oversized sword. Meanwhile, with seemingly little regard for his own demise, the other member of Akatsuki shot straight towards Jeriah, a maniacal expression stretched across his face and a flashy scythe in hand. Scooping Zabuza's cargo, a man who could only have been the country's daimyo out of harm's way with one rope of his hair, Jeriah felt his lungs swelling up with chakra and reared back. Katan, Ryuka no Jutsu, Fire Style, Dragon Flame Jutsu. Sheer heat searing his face, he blew out a stream of fire that roared along the ropes of his hair toward his opponents. In an instant, the one who had been making a beeline for Jeriah was consumed in the fire, and the smell of burning flesh filled his nostrils. On the other side of the battlefield, Zabuza raised his sword and sliced the air with a gigantic swing, countering the stream of fire headed in his direction. However, it was all he could do to raise it just in time to parry another sword, this time from Shirakumo. Jeriah returned his attention towards the man who was now a burning inferno before him. It was curious. By all standards, he should have been reduced to nothing but melted flesh and charred bone by now, but even as he could begin to make out hints of pure white bone in the man's face, the man kept walking toward him. His lips had burned off, but the bared teeth made it look as though he was grinning. No, the madman was actually laughing, the sound raising goosebumps along Jeriah's arms. In a single creaking motion, the burning skeletal frame raised its scythe. Since evading Jeriah's first attack, Kakuzu had made no move from the peripheries to help his allies, but he spoke now, in guttural tones, "Zabuza." It must have been a warning, thrusting his sword forward to force Shirakumo back. The missing nin held up his free hand in a telltale sign. Thick, immovable mist converged on the grounds, fogging his senses. "I will claim the bounty on your head, eventually." Kakuzu's disembodied voice rang out harshly. "But for now, you are not our target." And then they were gone. For a moment, Jeriah debated the merits of entering Sage Mode, as distasteful as its appearance was in giving chase, but dismissed it. There was a storm brewing in the horizon, and he had not survived on his own after all these years by remaining his younger, brash self. What he needed at this juncture was patience and more information on who exactly he was facing. A body soon approached Jeriah. It was Shirakumo. Drawing closer, he saw that the jonin was supporting on each arm the body of the daimyo and another boy. One of his students, perhaps. Shirakumo's voice was heavy. "Jeriah-sama, they've taken 2 of ours." Jeriah solemnly surveyed what he could of their surroundings. Most of the civilians in the vicinity had managed to escape before the confrontation, but there were casualties scattered here and there, hidden in the fog. While the intel he had received from Hiromo had led him here, he'd found no answers, only more questions. Such as, why were 2 members of Akatsuki here? Having tracked their movements over the years, Jeriah had found that they tended to work in pairs when hunting down particularly strong bounties or important targets. What was of such importance here in Wave Country that warranted the presence of not only 2 Akatsuki members, but an S-rank missing nin such as Zabuza? It was a gut feeling, but Jeriah suspected that there was something more at stake here than Gato's tyranny of a small island nation. In a flash, he made up his mind. "Take me to the others you were with. You owe me an explanation or 2. The sun was up, the ship had docked in Fire Country, and the remaining passengers were disembarking. The million-real question for Kakashi was, where was his team, +1? He spotted a straggler getting off the ship, swaying side to side down the ramp. It was the cabin boy he'd seen earlier, who'd been sacrificing the contents of his stomach all night. "Excuse me," Kakashi called out cheerily. "I've been expecting the arrival of 4 Chunin today from Wave Country. 3 males and 1 female, on the young side. Do you know where they are?" To his surprise, the cabin boy scowled. "Those thieves were ninja? Never got back on board, did they?" Kakashi blinked. "Excuse me?" They remained locked in their positions, their blades grinding into the others in a slow fall towards an impending assault. Sai's eyes had never looked so cold. "Do get out of my way, before I kill the both of you." Naruto could tell it wasn't an idle threat, but he didn't move. "Explain yourself." Meanwhile, with a hand reaching into his shuriken holster, Rai turned furiously towards Sai. "What are you doing? Get away from them!" Sai's gaze flickered to his teammate, and Naruto could see the calculations going through his mind. He tensed, readying himself for battle, but after a long, drawn-out moment, Sai lowered his blade. "How do you think she got away from that battle?" The question hung in the air, and Naruto turned to Cain. Despite the near attempt on her life, she was oddly composed. There was a resigned, almost relieved, look on her face, and with a lurching realization, it told him everything he needed to know. "How did you figure it out?" said the woman. I'd had my suspicions, your choice of cargo. The attack on the boat. The way your plans separated us. And they were all confirmed the moment I saw Zabuza let you go. In 2 rigid motions, Cain bobbed her head in acknowledgement. You weren't supposed to see that. I don't think you were supposed to survive. A slow, creeping sensation began to rise up in Naruto's chest. Wait, what's going on? Said Rai, wearing an expression as though he had just been clubbed. What are you talking about? It doesn't matter anymore, Cain shrugged with the weariness of defeat, and raised her bare hands in surrender. Do what you will with me. Sai cocked his head, raising an eyebrow at Naruto in a silent question. Naruto could have asked many questions of the woman standing before him, but only one rose unbidden to his lips. Who are you really working for? Her lips drew back in bitter relish, as though she had been waiting to hear that question her whole life. Akatsuki? When Mayu came to her senses, she was no longer fighting for her life in the iron grasp of the cloaked missing Nin. Instead, judging from the stiff material binding her arms to her sides and the stale feeling of air on her face, she was tied up on the ground somewhere indoors. Despite the rising sensation of panic in her stomach and the heat of bile in her throat, she forced herself to continue breathing at a slow, even pace. Next, taking great care, millimeter by millimeter, she opened her eyes a slit. Almost immediately, she wished she hadn't, for she was alone in a dimly lit cave. The foreboding sensation of being enclosed enveloped her, and the unease permeating her body intensified. Will he come for you, I wonder? A high voice rang out. A spike of chill ran down her spine, and Mayu's eyes flew all the way open. She struggled to flip onto her feet, but an inexplicable and absolute force kept her immobile in place, and the only thing she could do in that moment was to take in the sight which, contrary to her thoughts, stood before her. She was not alone. There was a man standing at the entrance of the cave. He wore the same black cloak the other missing Nin had been wearing, and a swirling orange mask hid his features from her. The 9 Tails Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto. What do you think about him? Chapter 24, Hidden Will to Fight. It had been years since Jeriah had last returned to Konoha, and in his absence, Naruto had grown up. Taking a good look at him, the boy's resemblance to his father was astonishing. If it wasn't for the flaming red hair he'd so clearly inherited from his mother, Jeriah would have thought it was his old student brought back from the dead. What's going on here? Shirakumo demanded, looking back and forth. Unfortunately, this was perhaps not the best time for a reunion between godfather and godson. The safe house Shirakumo had promised looked to have been compromised. With a single sweeping glance, Jeriah assessed the situation. Naruto, along with 3 other Leaf Chunin, surrounded a bound female civilian in what could only be an interrogation. Beyond them, a young female genin comforted 2 civilian children cowering in the corner. She betrayed us, said the blonde Chunin, his nostrils flared. We stayed here to help her, and she freaking betrayed us. An angry-looking Chunin rounded on Shirakumo. Where the hell is Mayu? Why is she not with you? The Jonin shook his head. I'm sorry. She and Tazuna were both taken. We don't know where, but we decided to first regroup to reassess the situation. Letting out a swear, the Chunin reached down and grabbed the bound woman by the scruff of her shirt. Where is she? Where did they take her? To her credit, the bound woman looked calm. I don't know. What do you mean you don't? Who are you? Naruto broke in. It was directed towards Jeriah. The boy's gaze had been fixed on him from the moment they had reached the safe house. Jeriah felt intrigue bubbling inside of him. With Naruto looking this similar physically to Minato, he had to wonder whether he took after him in other aspects as well. Thrusting out a hand, he struck a pose for the 2nd time that day. Thank you for asking. I am Mount Myaboka's Monk of the Frog Spirits, also known as the Toad Sage, Jeriah. Jeriah. Naruto had heard the name before there had been numerous records of the Sanin's legendary deeds from the Second World War. If he remembered correctly, the Hokage had once mentioned the name as well, in association with his father. In all the legends of the Sannin, however, none had mentioned a perverted old man who peeked in the women's baths. Naruto glanced at Shirakumo, but the Jonin's demeanor seemed unfazed around the man. Nor did he look as though he was being controlled by some sort of genjutsu. Was this man truly who he claimed to be, the great sage Jeriah? Could they count this strange man as a potential ally? It may have been a comforting thought, especially in the light of recent events. But whereas he could see Team Shirakumo's members relaxing, Naruto did not jump to the happy possibility. Instead, he maintained his distance. He would choose his own allies, he thought. Does Akatsuki mean anything to you too? Naruto asked. As expected, Shirakumo shook his head, but Jeriah looked intrigued. Is this civilian involved in Akatsuki? What is Akatsuki? Naruto pressed. Jeriah stroked his chin. They're an organization I've been tracking for years now. For all intents and purposes, they function like mercenaries, taking on all sorts of nasty, shady missions the villages don't want to be associated with. But as for their final objective, well, that's why I'm still out in the field. Let me say this, at least. It was Cain, her chin jutting out stiffly. The true reason why Gato has been able to stay in power is because Akatsuki has been supporting him from the shadows. Then how could you be working for them? Rai exploded. I thought you wanted to help this country. They made me a deal. I was to go into the Hidden Leaf, request Chunin bodyguards on a journey to Wave Country, and delay their return for as long as possible. In turn, they would withdraw their support for Gato, allowing us to overthrow him and take back the daimyo. Cain's voice grew quiet. And of course, they reminded me of the consequences of failure. Naruto's thoughts flashed back to their journey across the water, on the mysterious assassination attempt on the merchant. Sai's eyes narrowed. You sure are speaking freely. Why is that? Even if you all kill me now, I've carried out my end of the deal. This country will soon be free. Gato will be dead, and my brother's death won't have been in vain. A mixture of both resignation and pride struggled for dominance on Cain's face. There's no longer any reason for me to hide the truth. As I said, do what you will with me. I'm prepared for the consequences. But why? Menma spoke up. Why would this Akatsuki group want to keep some random leaf nin here in Wave Country? Perhaps it wasn't so random, said Jeriah, staring straight at Naruto. One by one, the pieces were coming together. Judging by the glimmer of realization in Shirakumo's eyes and the puzzled looks on his teammates' faces, everyone his own age had been kept in the dark regarding Naruto. He felt a stab of irritation. Considering how the Hokage had gone out of his way to even put a seal on his memories, he thought the old man would have at least done a better job of keeping him a village secret. But now it seemed as though he was on the hit list of every other missing nin out there. They're capturing Jinchuriki, he said at last. And they're here for me. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto. What do you think about him? Before she could stop herself, Mayu felt her eyes widen. How did this man know about Naruto? But no, she couldn't reveal that she understood his question. I don't know who you're talking about, she said, bracing herself for the man's reaction. Instead, he seemed to take it in stride. Well, of course you do. He's your teammate, and current team leader. From his similar attire, and the way the man freely walked about the cave, it was clear that he was associated with the missing nin who had captured her. However, that was the only thing he seemed to have in common with them. He didn't inspire overwhelming terror in the way those two did. He was just weird. As discreetly as she could, Mayu scanned their vicinity. Apart from the man, they were alone. She felt her heart lift. While she had been disarmed and bound with rope, she could still feel the clips in her hair. In a voice that sounded stronger than she felt, she demanded, "What do you want from me? I'm not important enough to my village to ransom with, and no one's going to come here for me." Suddenly, with a pang, she thought of Rai. With any luck, Naruto would be able to hold him back from making any rash moves. "Oh ho! So he's trash," said the man in a cheery voice. Despite herself, Mayu frowned. "That's not what I said. What kind of team leader wouldn't come to rescue his team member?" She hesitated. "The mission is more important than the individual. Naruto won't come to rescue me." The force that had previously kept her frozen in place was gone, and she struggled up to her feet. "Because I don't need him to." For some reason, that seemed to greatly amuse the man, who broke out into a laugh and began to spin around. "You think so? Kakuzu-san's keeping you here as bait, you know. But if they're not coming for you, why are we even keeping you here then, Mayu started to try and wriggle a hand free. If she could just make the sign, she'd be able to release her bluebirds. Oh look! The man was staring outside the cave's entrance, his form awash in the glow of the setting sun. The day's almost over. You know what sounds good right about now? Some dango. Should I send you home in time for dinner? She couldn't believe her ears. Home? Why not? The man spun back around and approached Mayu with a kunai. She flinched, but in a smooth motion, he cut through her bindings. The broken rope tumbled down to her feet. Rubbing the bruises on her arms, she stared at him in disbelief. Why are you letting me go? And where's Tazuna-san? If you're referring to that old bridge builder, I released him a while ago. But why? Why capture us in the first place at all? Tut tut. The man wagged his finger. Too many questions, not enough escaping. What'll you do if Kakuzu-san comes back and you're still here? He had a point. Mayu took a step towards the entrance and paused. Thank you, whoever you are. The man bowed mockingly. You can call me Toby. It was a scenario that Naruto had rehearsed in his head countless times, the moment his teammates learned the truth about him. In the nights when he'd been unable to find anything else to occupy his thoughts, he'd approached it in many ways. Sometimes he tried bringing it up on his own. Other times, he was cornered into revealing his secret. Whatever the approach, his teammates' imagined reactions always remained fairly constant. Rai erupted in anger and accused him of being a traitor, while Mayu either calmed him down or shrank back in terror. Now, it was actually happening, but in a way that Naruto, for all the thought he'd put into it, had never predicted. The first difference was that Mayu was not present, and at the reminder of her absence, Naruto felt a pang. The second difference was Rai's reaction: confusion, disbelief, realization, shock, horror. A myriad of emotions twisted his teammate's face, before melting away into one single, surprising emotion: concern. Then this is all a trap, isn't it? To get Naruto? Jeriah nodded solemnly. Their objective is still unclear, but one thing's for certain. Several other Jinchuriki have already disappeared, and in all cases, there were signs of Akatsuki interference. I can personally confirm the current presence of 2 Akatsuki members here in this area, Haiden and Kakuzu. With Naruto here, this is no mere coincidence. At the names of the 2 missing nin, Naruto, who had been too stunned to respond, felt a jolt. That was another piece, falling into place. Then we must let Hokage-sama know, Shirakumo said sharply. This isn't just a matter related to Wave Country anymore, this now concerns the safety of our entire village. He motioned towards Naruto. He needs to be returned to Konoha immediately. Sai, who had been taking in the situation in shrewd silence, raised a hand. Using my super beast imitating technique, we can be back in Konoha before the end of the day. Wait, Rai protested. What about Mayu and Tazuna? Before we can consider any rescue missions, Naruto's security comes first. What are you talking about? Trap or no trap, have you even seen him fight? He can take care of himself. Right, Naruto? With another jolt, Naruto realized that Rai had turned to him for backup. Rationally speaking, it was a no-brainer. Assuming that Jiraiya's intel was accurate and Akatsuki was a true threat, it would be senseless for Naruto to stay in Wave Country. He had not forgotten the results of his previous confrontation with Kakuzu. Despite Rai's confidence in him, he had been powerless then, and though he hated to admit it, he would be powerless now. The best option would be to return to Konoha with the rest of his team, alert the Hokage, and if possible, send out an elite rescue force. Although of course by then, it could be too late. Everyone else had fallen silent, waiting for his response. Rai's ferocious expression was starting to become undone, with the beginnings of fear taking its place. Naruto knew what was being asked of him. It had been a long time coming, ever since the day he and his teammates sat around a campfire in a dark crystal cave. The situation was almost comical. How had a simple bodyguard mission turned out this way? The Hokage had said it was a mission to help him gain experience, and if he did well, he would be considered for a position as a Jonin. A Jonin was a ninja who had the ability to make tough, split-second decisions in the face of conflict. The question was, which did he choose? The continued security of the rest of his team and the village? That was the smart, Jonin bet. Or would he gamble it all away for an unnecessarily high-risk rescue mission? He wondered what Kakashi would have done, and shook his head. It really was a no-brainer. Naruto cleared his throat. We're not leaving without them. It looked like he wouldn't be getting that promotion anytime soon. Leaving behind Shirakumo's genin team to guard the safe house, they immediately left the settlement. Luckily for the group, Jiraiya's earlier session with Zabuza's henchwomen had yielded several answers that were starting to prove more and more useful, mainly the location of Gato's main hideout. It was situated in the middle of the marshlands, hidden from any uninformed eyes by dense mist. As they made their way through the forest, deftly hiding the sounds of their progress, the going was tense. The group's feelings were mixed on the matter, that much was obvious. While Shirakumo hadn't seemed too happy about the decision, he had bent his knee once Jeriah showed his support. His face lined with apprehension, the Jonin accompanied them now in grudging silence. A Chunin who the others had called Sai wore a smile on his face like a mask. Jeriah mentally marked him as one to watch. The other Chunin with the similar-sounding name Rai, was it? Though he was the most ordinary of the lot, he seemed equally the most driven in this rescue mission. Whether his enthusiasm would serve to be a hindrance, or not, remained to be seen. And finally Naruto. Going by the reports Jeriah had heard over the past several years, he wouldn't have expected such brashness from the boy. It seemed there was more of his mother in him than he thought. Jeriah wasn't a fool. At a minimum, what awaited them were 3S-level missing Nin. While he had confidence in his own abilities, even with a Jonin of Shirakumo's caliber and 3 skilled Chunin by his side, he had no doubt it would turn out to be a very close fight. However, though he would never admit this to the others, he was never one to pass up an opportunity to save a damsel in distress. Moreover, Naruto's decision on the matter intrigued him, and Jeriah was willing to see where it took them. Have you tried to control the Nine Tails chakra yet? He asked. Naruto's expression didn't change. Once. He left it at that. The boy didn't trust Jeriah. He couldn't blame him. In all his years of absence, he was a complete stranger to Naruto. Of course, Jeriah had his reasons. He'd been away under the Third's orders, tracking down and gathering information regarding Akatsuki. Nonetheless, it was an undeniable truth that he had neglected his duty as godfather. Perhaps, Jeriah thought to himself, after all this was done and settled with, it was time that he trained the boy. The journey by ship had taken the better part of 3 days, but running at top speed across the water surface, Kakashi covered the same distance in a matter of hours. As soon as the mist began to fade and the coastline appeared in the horizon, he began his retrieval strategy. Kuchios no Jutsu, summoning technique. A black seal appeared momentarily on the water surface, and in a cloud of smoke, his Nikken pack appeared by his side. Kakashi held out the only thing he had been able to find on the ship, a cloak that Naruto's shadow clone had presumably been wearing. I'll need you guys to get to work right away. Once his hounds had the scent, they ran off ahead of Kakashi towards the main island. Reaching the shore, he immediately noticed the difference since he had last left it several days before. In the place of the once crowded, worn-down settlement, there was now a muted emptiness. Buildings appeared to have been smashed to pieces. What had been destitute before had been replaced by complete and utter abandonment. The only sign of activity was smoke, rising in the distance from the forest. Had there been an attack in the city? Where had everyone gone? Kakashi picked his way through the settlement, noting several strewn bodies in the rubble. Thankfully, none of them wore the leaf Hitai ate. At the edges of the settlement, one of his hounds returned to him. Did you get anything? Asked Kakashi. There's a fresh trail that leads from the city and through the forest, said Pakin. But I also found someone wandering around, with whiffs of the scent. Pakin led him deeper into the forest, and soon, Kakashi spotted an older bespectacled man leaning against a tree trunk for support. After a moment, he recognized him as Tazuna, the man Naruto and the rest of his team had been staying with. I'm not your enemy, Kakashi said, stopping before him. Letting out a surprised yelp, Tazuna fell backwards and began scrabbling on the ground. Who are you? Are you here to finish me off? I'm a ninja from Konoha, and I'm looking for Naruto and his team. Can you tell me what's happened and where they are? The older man hesitated, his eyes squinting suspiciously at Kakashi's masked face. They let me go, but they kept the girl. They told me to tell Naruto and the others. I have to find them now. Kakashi's heart skipped a beat. They? Could you tell me where they are? It was more difficult than Mayu had expected, getting through the marshlands. The joy she had felt when she had first left the cave had since dissipated into a rising sense of trepidation as the elements took a turn for the worse. The fog grew thick and heavy, and the air turned freezing. Continuing onwards, Mayu carried herself on thoughts of how her teammates would react when she reached the safe house. Rai would be the first to react. He'd be grinning widely, punching her on the shoulder for making him worry. Naruto would be standing to the side, not saying much as usual, but with a relieved look in his eyes and one less burden weighing him down. Once they were back in Konoha, she thought she would have to buy them bowls of ramen to make up for it. Kakashi-sensei would be there too, and Rai would be complaining about Sai. Naruto would be. The mist was thick. Too thick. Mayu's heart began pounding. She remembered this fog. It was not natural. It was a ninjutsu. It had been how her captors had first gotten away. It all happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, she was alone in the fog with her thoughts. Next, she was flanked on both sides. An unnatural gust of wind blew away some of the nearby mist, revealing two dark figures, one tall and one short. Mayu felt hot bile rising in her throat, but she pushed it back. In a flash, she made the appropriate signs with her hands, and an instant later, her bluebirds were unfurling themselves from her hair. Naruto. Rai. Please find them. Drawing back in a defensive position, Mayu took in a deep breath. She wasn't completely defenseless. Though she didn't have any of her weapons, she still had her. She could buy some time with that. Her birds would dissipate the moment she died, but if it was the last thing she did, she would warn her team. Chapter 25, Floating Dead Leaves. Mayu had never really stood out, but when she passed the exam for the academy, her mother bought her a bag that she had been pining over for the past few months, a bright blue, fluffy ball-shaped one. Her big brother Izumo gave her the look when he saw her wearing it for the first time. Mayu, I don't know how to break this to you, but you're going to be made fun of. Mayu stuck her tongue out at him and ran to school, where she found out that her brother, like always, was 100% correct. As soon as the teacher left the lecture hall, some of the other children gathered around her and ripped the bag off her back. What is this? You call yourself a ninja? Ha! I say it's perfect. An ugly bag for an ugly girl. They began to throw it back and forth amongst each other, and when she grabbed it, they threw it on the ground. Feeling bewildered and overwhelmed, amidst their laughter, she felt her eyes grow hot with tears. She had wanted to be noticed, but now she wished they would leave her alone. Suddenly, she felt a shadow on her face. Looking up, she saw a dark-haired boy staring down at her eye. Mayu knew him, of course. He was in her class, and unlike her, he had a lot of friends. His older brother Kotetsu was also Izumo's best friend. Kotetsu brought him along sometimes, but the most they'd done was silently sit at opposite ends of the sandbox while their brothers talked. Rai scowled at her, and for a second she thought he would yell at her. He picked up her bag, and she flinched, but then, he slung it over his back. Real ninja can wear anything, he told the stunned children. It was the best day of her life, the day when she made her first friend. The worst day of her life followed shortly afterwards. It began when Mayu found herself hiding from her brother in a shrub, right under the kitchen window. Mayu! She heard Izumo yell out, as he stormed into the kitchen. A dry leaf poked uncomfortably into her cheek, but she dared not move. Izumo was a lot older than her, and a Chunin. He would find her right away if she made a single sound. But over the years, Mayu had gotten quite adept at avoiding detection by her brother, a fact that both pleased and infuriated him. Mother, have you seen Mayu? What is it now? She heard their mother laugh. Hearing her ringing laugh brought a smile to Mayu's face. Their mother was the nicest person in the village, and made the best cakes to boot. Her mother was baking one now, and the smell of the crispy apple filling made her salivate. She skipped going to the academy today again, Izumo complained. It reflects badly on me that my own sister is like this, you know. I'd say it's healthier for a child to be running around, having fun than to be sitting in a classroom learning how to kill people, their mother said in a mild tone. She could practically hear Izumo roll his eyes. Oh, not this again. Their mother did not approve of Mayu attending the academy. Though she never said why, Izumo had told Mayu it was because their father had died years ago in battle. Izumo, on the other hand, wanted her to at least learn the basics of defending herself. There had been a big fight over it, she remembered. But Izumo won in the end, and she had to start attending the academy. On the bright side, Rai was there, so it wasn't so bad. But it was so boring. Mayu didn't care about learning how to set traps or throwing a shuriken with perfect precision. She would much rather run around the village with Rai, listening to all the merchant stories at the market, looking at the clouds in the sky, and watching birds eat breadcrumbs from her hands. There was a light slapping sound. No, don't eat it, their mother said. What? Why not? Izumo whined. It's not for you. Then who? It's not someone's birthday, is it? There was a small pause. You don't mean you're making a cake for that thing, are you? Mayu's ears perked up. What thing was this? Their mother said quietly, and what if I am? I thought Izumo hesitated. I thought we had agreed that you were going to keep your distance from it. I don't even understand why Hokage-sama's put you up to this. He knows it's because of that thing, that father. I have raised that child for the past 3 years, said their mother. And I have kept my distance. But the more I see him, the more I realize that he doesn't understand anything. He doesn't know anything. He's only a child, like Mayu. At the mention of her name, Mayu gulped and uttered a silent prayer that she would never be caught eavesdropping. How could you say that? Izumo sounded angry. Have you even seen what that thing looks like? It's not a human, it's the damn fox itself. That's just the Uzumaki clan trait, and you know it, Izumo. It's Naruto's 6th birthday tomorrow, and he's never even had a cake, so heavens help me, I am making him one. And that's final. Of course, after all that, Mayu had to see the boy for herself. The other kids jeered about him sometimes, but she'd never met him before. However, he wasn't hard to find. She soon caught his face peeking out of an apartment window by the market. He was the complete opposite of Mayu, easy to single out, with his bright red hair and unique facial markings. She waved up at him. Hi there. Immediately his face disappeared from view. She frowned, and tried again. Do you want to play hide and seek? There was no response, and she was about to give up, when she heard a small voice. I don't know how to. What a weird kid, she thought. That's okay, I'll teach you, she said. I'm Mayu. What's your name? Naruto. It was a bright sunny day out, but for some reason, Naruto seemed reluctant to leave his apartment. Nonetheless, with some coaxing, Mayu was leading him towards the park when they ran into Rai, who was throwing shuriken at a homemade target. Looking curious, he wandered over. What are you doing? And who's that? This is the boy my mom's taking care of. She gestured back at Naruto. Come on, say hello. Hello? Hold on, I know him. Rai peered at Naruto, who shrank backwards. Yeah, he's the one Kayumo's mom told us to stay away from. Really? Why? Rai shrugged. I dunno. She got mad at Kayumo for letting him join our game of tag. Why would she? He's just a kid like us. Mayu smiled encouragingly down at Naruto. Right. At first the boy didn't respond, and she was about to turn around and call it quits when his whiskered face broke out into a small smile. How cute, she thought. She couldn't have been more wrong. It all happened so suddenly. One moment, she was pulling Naruto by the hand, and the next, they were surrounded by a group of armed figures. They didn't wear the Hitai of any villages, they were rogue ninja. Mayu wished she had paid more attention at the academy, but it was too late for that. She was helpless, and was soon immobilized. Though Rai put up more of a fight, trying to fight back with his shuriken, even he couldn't do anything. One of the rogues threw a kunai at him, and Rai let out a howl of pain as it struck his cheek in a splash of blood. Another rogue hit the back of his head, and then Rai was on the ground, unmoving. Now they were somewhere underground, below the village, the sewers. She knew some of the older kids sometimes sneaked in there, but she hadn't dared to until now. They'd never mentioned how suffocating it was, being surrounded on all four sides with no windows or doors. There was only darkness, the dirty smell of sewage, and the sound of running water. Mayu had never been so scared in her life. The narrow walls of the tunnel around her seemed like they were shrinking around her, and she couldn't breathe. Her heart was pounding so hard in her chest it hurt. All of a sudden, the rogue who was holding Mayu stopped. There was sweat on his hands, and it seeped into her mouth. "They're coming." The warning came not a moment too soon, as three dark figures swooped down from the ceiling. They wore animal masks, the ANBU. The rogues around her drew their weapons, and immediately engaged them. Amidst the clanging and screaming of metal meeting metal, Mayu felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know much about the mysterious masked ninja, but they were reputed as some of the best in the village. Surely, she thought, they were safe now. "Stop!" the rogue holding Mayu cried out. Something cold and sharp touched her neck. "If you don't, I'll kill her here and now." All three ANBU froze. "Mayu!" one of them shouted. It took a moment for her to recognize the voice behind the mask. It was her mother. Then, knowing that, she could no longer hold back the tears. "Mom!" She struggled to free herself, but the man's grip was too strong. "Your daughter? Lucky us. How's this for a trade then? You let us go with the Jinchuriki, and we give you these two other kids back." There was a pause. "Very well," said a male ANBU's voice. The bruising hold on Mayu slackened, and the other rogues began to retreat, taking Naruto's limp body with them. Tears and slime streaming down her face, Mayu ran into her mother's tight embrace. For a moment, all was well. She could hear her mother breathing in her ear, and she breathed back in hers. One of the ANBU stepped up to them, sounding worried. "What are we going to tell Hokage-sama?" "That we were unable to rescue the Jinchuriki," said the male. "This is our chance to get rid of that thing. We'll be lucky if they kill it." Mayu wished with all her heart that she could get out of that horrible dark tunnel. She wanted to sleep in her mother's arms that night and forget that this had all ever happened. But she couldn't stop thinking about how Naruto had smiled up at her. What about Naruto?" she said in a small voice. Her mother's hold on her body tightened. Mayu felt her heart beating rapidly against hers. And then her mother pulled away and stood up. "I'm going after them." "What are you talking about?" The male ANBU sounded confused. "You of all people? This is what you've always wanted. Just leave the creature." Her mother shook her head and looked straight at Mayu. "What kind of ninja are we, if we abandon a child here?" The male ANBU scoffed. "He's a monster." Her mother didn't say anything. Instead, she drew her sword, and then she was gone, swallowed up in the darkness of the tunnel. Mayu was never sure about what happened next. The other ANBU took Rai and left, but Mayu refused to leave without her mother. The male ANBU was on the verge of dragging her out of the tunnel, when he suddenly froze. She wondered what had happened when it hit her, like a wave. She'd never felt chakra like this before. It was the most overwhelming, terrible thing she'd ever felt. It choked her, it covered her. And then she saw him. It was Naruto. He was coming back, alone. But there was something strange about him. There was a bright red shroud covering his entire body, and he walked on all fours like an animal. Mayu hesitated. "Naruto?" The male ANBU shouted, "Get away from him! He'll kill you!" She flinched back, and the male ANBU raced forward, holding his sword before him. He was going to kill Naruto, but then, faster than she could follow, a blur of red jumped into the air. There was a loud, terrible cracking sound, and she realized with a jolt that Naruto had bit into and broken the ANBU's neck. The man gurgled, his hands grasping belatedly at his ragged neck. His body twitched a few times, before slumping down. The thing landed back in the water with a splash. Letting out a sob, Mayu tried to step back, but fell over instead. It was drawing closer. The red shroud around its body swung back and forth like a tail. There was something dark dripping off of its face. It was the ANBU's blood. "Where's my mom?" she cried. "What did you do?" It was right before her now, and she could see its red, slit eyes. It looked at her, and she looked at it, and she knew in her heart that she was looking in the face of a monster. Something heavy struck her in the head, and she felt herself fall over. She could hear muffled shouting in the distance. Her body was sinking into something warm and thick. And then everything turned black. When Mayu opened her eyes again, her mother was dead, and her entire world had changed. Rai couldn't remember anything. Having been knocked out, he'd missed the entire thing. The only indication that something had ever happened to him was a long, ropey scar on his face. Ironically enough, Mayu escaped the incident physically unscathed. During her short stay in the hospital, she found herself surrounded by members of the intelligence division who asked her questions after questions. She didn't say much, only responding that she couldn't remember what had happened, until the Hokage himself came to her room and made them leave. The day she was discharged, when she arrived at her house door, she stopped and knocked. Nobody answered, and after a while, she let herself in. Izumo wasn't there. She hadn't seen her brother since he'd visited her, red-eyed, in the hospital. The only thing left in the house was a stale cake. It rained for days afterward, as though the skies themselves were crying. But Mayu couldn't cry anymore. The whole world had turned gray, and she didn't shed a single tear. Years passed in that way. Izumo stopped coming home, using his work as an excuse. It rained and rained. Eventually, Mayu graduated from the academy. She was placed in the same team as the monster, and she knew that she was being punished by the heavens. Their Jonin sensei gave them a test, and Mayu would have been content to fail if it meant she wouldn't have to be around the monster anymore. But the monster brought to her and Rai a plan, and it worked. Their team began going on missions. Even though Mayu often lost her concentration in the monster's presence, it never lost its patience with her. It was intelligent and strong, and sometimes she had to stop herself from admiring it. One day, on a bodyguard mission, the monster killed several bandit men. It was expressionless about it, its face dripping with blood. Mayu had expected as much. Later that night, she passed by its wagon and heard a sound. Pulling out her kunai, she went inside and saw the monster shaking in its sleep. It was a nightmare. Its face looked younger than usual, more vulnerable. Mayu wasn't so weak, however. She didn't let it deceive her. But soon afterwards, the monster had to go and save someone. A young civilian boy. Without any regard for itself, the monster jumped in front of the boy and was hit by a shard of metal. It would have died, if it had been normal. It turned out that Kakashi-sensei knew about the monster as well. He told her about how the monster was something called a Jinchuriki, and how a tailed beast had been sealed inside it as a baby. That night, Mayu knelt by the monster's side. She could tell it was awake, and she heard their breathing synchronize in the darkness. She looked at its face for a long time. She held its hand, and she decided to give in to the deception. Things got easier after that. It became him. The monster became Naruto. She stopped flinching every time Naruto was near her. When Naruto praised her, she began to feel proud, and when he seemed disappointed in her, she trained harder. She started wondering about how Naruto was eating. She baked him a birthday cake, and she could tell that he didn't like it, but he ate it all without a word of complaint. And then one evening, she found herself sitting at ramen at Chiraku with the others. Kakashi-sensei was reading his adult books. She and Rai weren't arguing for once, and the three of them were digging into their bowls. Mayu finished first, and when she looked up, she caught sight of Naruto smiling faintly into his ramen. Her chest throbbed. Ichiraku buzzed with the sound of customers, and the store's glowing lanterns bobbed in the night breeze. The rich smell of miso ramen wafted out through the hanging flaps. Something wet and hot dripped down her face. The world wasn't so gray after all, she thought. As always, Rai was the first to notice. They had reached the last of the trees, and the seemingly endless marshlands spread out before them. The others had already landed on the marsh ground, and right as Naruto was about to jump down, he saw Rai come to a screeching stop. "Wait!" he cried out. And then Naruto saw a blue feather, floating down through the air. When he reached out for it with his hand, the moment it touched his palm, a sudden influx of images rushed into his mind's eye. The sound of wings flapped in the air above him, and he looked up just in time to see a bluebird soaring past the treetops, into the sky. He blinked, and then it was gone. Thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun as I did putting this epic what if together. Make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a single twist in the story. Drop your thoughts, theories, or even wild ideas in the comments. I read every single one. And hey, if you're craving more awesome Naruto content, go check out the other videos on the channel. I've got plenty of heat waiting for you. Until next time, stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember, even a shadow clone needs love. Peace out.